Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're at the Like Button's house and need to use their bathroom, don't use their toilet paper. Instead, use dozens and dozens of quadruple ply paper towels. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Around 7:20 p.m. on the evening of December 11th, 2002, a police department in a rural English county called Surrey started receiving all these frantic emergency calls. Now, all of these calls were coming from drivers on a heavily trafficked highway called the A3, and they all were saying the same things. They had seen this totally reckless driver with super bright headlights that was weaving in and out of traffic and going at high speeds and nearly crashing into people. And then a couple of the callers said they actually saw this car go down the embankment off the side of the highway, and so it looked like they might have crashed. And so, of course, this police department, after getting all these calls, decided to send out a couple of officers to see what was going on. When the 2 officers got out to the A3 and began patrolling the area on the A3 where all these calls were saying they had seen this reckless driver, they didn't see the driver. They didn't see a wreck on the side of the road. They didn't see any signs of an accident. I mean, there was nothing there. Now, had only one person called in about this wild, reckless driver, at this point, the officers would have chalked this up to a mistake or even a prank. But so many people called in about this one particular reckless driver on the A3 that these 2 officers decided to just keep on looking and really see if they can figure out where this driver went. And so to this point, the 2 police officers had been just driving on the A3 to try to find this driver. And so they decided they would park their vehicle, get out, and walk on foot on the edge of the highway because there were these huge forests that lined either side of the A3. In fact, Surrey, the county in England where this was one of the most heavily forested areas in all of England. And so these forests on either side of the A3 were very dense. You could not see very far into them. And so these officers were thinking that it might be possible that this driver, if they were driving as recklessly as all the callers made it seem like, they could have veered off the highway, gone down the embankment, and then because they were going at such a high speed, they could have crashed their way into one of these forests and basically disappeared from view from the road. That in order to see this crash in the forest, you'd have to be basically in the forest. And so these 2 officers, they pulled over, they got out, and they began walking along the edge of the highway, staring into the forest, looking for a sign of a car wreck. And sure enough, after walking for a while, one of the officers spotted something deep in the woods that looked almost metallic or plastic. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be in the forest. And so the officers made their way into the tree line and began walking through all the trees. And as they got closer, they realized very clearly there was a car. There was a wreck in the forest. And so the 2 officers, they begin running towards the wreck. They're calling for backup on the radio. They get to this wreck in the middle of the forest, and they're on the driver's side, and they look inside the car, and there's no driver in the driver's seat, but they looked through the car to the passenger side, and they saw the front passenger door was wide open, and on the ground on the other side of the car was very clearly a body. And so the 2 police officers rushed around the car to get a better look at the body. And when they did, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It didn't make any sense. Like, what was this? Now, to understand why these police officers were so caught off guard by what they were seeing, we need to go back 5 months to July 16th, 2002. On that night, a 21-year-old man named Christopher Brian Chandler finished up his beer at a pub in West London. And for reference, where this pub was located was about 1 hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey where the car was found in the woods. This night, Christopher had gone to this pub with a close friend of his. This was meant to be a fun night out. But, as Chris is finishing up this beer, he began to feel really antsy because it turned out Christopher was actually wanted by police in London for robbery, and so he hated staying in one place for too long. And so the only people who even knew where Christopher was the friend he was with at the bar, and then also Christopher's brother. He knew he was at this particular pub. And so finally, Christopher got so anxious about being in this pub for too long that he told the friend he was with that he just wanted to leave. And so he said goodnight to his friend. The friend stayed at the pub, and Christopher left, got in his car, and began driving south. But Christopher never arrived at the place he was trying to go. He just sort of disappeared, and nobody heard from him again. Christopher's brother eventually would report Christopher missing, but remember, the brother knows Christopher is wanted for robbery, and so Christopher suddenly going on the lam and just disappearing for a while was kind of par for the course, and so the brother really didn't think this was a big deal. And also, the police felt the same way because they know Christopher is trying to elude them, and so it makes sense he would be missing. And so as a result, nobody really followed up on Christopher's missing person report. Everybody just kind of moved on. That is, until 5 months later, when all those drivers began calling into the police in Surrey about seeing this totally reckless driver careening down the A3, who eventually crashed into a ditch. And then those two officers, they went out to that stretch of A3, and sure enough, it was Christopher's car, and the body on the ground was Christopher. However, there was a problem. When the two police officers walked up on Christopher's car and saw it for the first time, they were struck by how old it looked. But it didn't really register with them why that would matter. It just stood out to them that this is a really, really old and rusted up car. But when they went around to look at the body on the ground, Christopher's body, they saw that his body was actually mostly a skeleton, which meant Christopher did not crash and die on this night, December 11th, 2002. Very likely, he crashed and died 5 months earlier, right around the time he disappeared. Now, the Surrey police, they say that this was all just one big coincidence, that the reckless driver that all these drivers were reporting that night on the A3 must have not crashed and actually just kind of got away, and then just by coincidence, when the police were searching that area of the A3 for the reckless driver, they happened upon Chris and his car. But remember, several of the drivers who called in that night about seeing this reckless driver on the A3, they specifically said they saw the car veer off the embankment and crash down below near the tree line. Like, this is a serious crash. Someone needs to get out here with an ambulance because probably someone's hurt. And then when the police got out and searched the exact area where this crash supposedly happened, they find Chris's car that had all the hallmarks of a car that was driving recklessly on the A3 that veered off and crashed into the woods. I mean, they found Chris and his car because of these calls, but it could not have been Chris. But what other car could it have been? As of today, we do not have a good explanation for how this happened, and so it's been dubbed the A3 ghost crash. Well, we finally did it. I don't know if it was all the acid we poured into their contact lens solution, or if it was all the wild predators we released in their house, but somehow, some way, we killed the like button. And I know this because the ghost of the like button paid me a visit last night. And after slapping me right in the anti-tragus and then pouring fox urine in my eyes, the ghost of the like button said, "Listen here, Mr. Ballin, if you want to bring me back to life and keep up with your antics, you need to bring me one piece of brand new Mr. Ballin merchandise." And I said, "Are you kidding me? Of course! We just launched a brand new merch line called Ballin Basics on shopmrballin.com right in time for the holidays. Ballin Basics has all your Mr. Ballin essentials like a sick hoodie, a great crew neck, heck, there's even a special collector's item, the old Sigalang pin, and they're all numbered. There's only 500 of them, so get them while supplies last. So again, go to shopmrballin.com. Ballin Basics is live right now, so get your new merch, get your collector's item pin, old Sigalang. Meanwhile, I'll work on resurrecting the like button so we can continue to find fulfillment in our lives by slipping some mayonnaise in the like button's peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Happy holidays, everybody. Go to shopmrballin.com. Mr. Ballin, ooh. It's not even funny. On the morning of August 2nd, 2017, two men sat together laughing inside of a bar in a tiny village in northern France. The men were named Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin, and even though there was a massive age difference between them, Lucien was 69 years old and Olivier was 38 years old, the two were totally inseparable, to the point where the people in the village referred to them as father and son. Lucien had spent his whole life working in manufacturing in a nearby city, but just 4 years earlier, he had finally retired and he had moved into a small home inside of this northern French village. But when he had first moved into this new home, he had been very lonely and sad. Lucien was divorced, he struggled with alcohol, and he had had a really tough life, and he just wasn't doing well. But when he met Olivier, his whole life turned around. When the two met, Olivier also was kind of like a down on his luck guy. He was struggling with some health issues that made it hard to work, and so for years he had been bouncing between the nearby city and this village in northern France looking for work, somewhat unsuccessfully. And so when these two happened to connect, it's like they bonded over having kind of difficult lives. And for Lucien, what really mattered to him was Olivier, despite being so much younger than him, did not treat Lucien like he was this dried up, worthless old man. He treated Lucien like a peer. And so together, these two very unlikely best friends began kind of orchestrating their lives around the other. And before long, it was like their lives had all this new structure and routine and meaning to them, because again, the two men got to be together basically all day long. So, on this particular morning, as Olivier and Lucien were together at this bar, they began talking about what they wanted to do that night. And they settled on having a barbecue at Lucien's house. Lucien would cook up some beef and they would sit out on his back garden patio and just spend the night together. It sounded like a wonderful plan. And in fact, the bartender would say that when Olivier and Lucien finally left the bar that day, that he recalled overhearing them being so excited about this particular barbecue. And so that evening, Olivier and Lucien arrived at Lucien's house and they went out to the back patio where Lucien had already draped a nice tablecloth over this small round table. It was a red and white checkered patterned tablecloth, and on this table was an open bottle of wine and some cheese and a baguette. And so Olivier, he sat down and began enjoying some wine and bread, and Lucien walked over to the grill and began cooking up the beef. Lucien had a neighbor. We're going to call her Marie because we don't actually know her real name. And Marie's second floor window overlooked Lucien's garden patio where the two men were having this cookout. And so that night, Marie did glance out and saw the two men kind of listening to music and goofing around. And she was used to them spending lots of time together. And she was also used to them staying up late at night. And so she figured, tonight's going to be another one of those nights where these guys are up late, having wine, celebrating, whatever. She was just going to shut the window and try to ignore the noise coming in and just let them do their thing. And so eventually Marie would do that. She would go to bed to the sound of music coming from next door and the sound of men talking. And then the next morning, when Marie got up around 6 a.m., she looked out that window again and frankly was not that shocked at what she saw. Lucien was still just sitting at the table, looking like he could be eating some bread or still drinking wine, and Olivier had clearly passed out on the ground. Now, Marie didn't judge. She knew these two liked to stay up late and drink and do stuff like this, and so she thought, you know what? None of my business. Then at 9 a.m., so 3 hours after Marie had first woken up, she left her house to go to another neighbor's house to feed their chickens while they were away for the day. As she passed by Lucien's house, she glanced into his back garden patio, and she saw Lucien was still just sitting at the table, and Olivier was still passed out on the ground. It was like they hadn't moved for 3 hours. But again, Marie's thinking, none of my business. And so she just kept on going, went to her neighbor's house and fed the chickens. But when Marie came back to her house 3 hours later around noon, she looked again into Lucien's backyard and she saw the two men still had not moved. Lucien is sitting at the table and Olivier is laying on the ground. And suddenly Marie's thinking, wait a minute, the sun is high in the sky right now. These guys aren't moving. They're going to get heat stroke. We got to do something about this. And so she yelled out to Olivier and Lucien, but she got no response. And so Marie just walked into Lucien's backyard, and as she got closer and closer to the two men, she realized that they were not moving at all. Like they were not breathing. Something was horribly wrong here. And so Marie, she just turned and ran to another neighbor's house. She told them what was going on, and they got these big pots of water, and they ran back and doused Olivier and Lucien with water, trying to get them to snap out of their drunken stupor. But the two men did not move at all when the water hit them. Clearly, they were dead. The next day, the local prosecutor announced there was going to be an investigation into the two men's deaths, which were being classified as criminal acts. And the prosecutor also said that it seemed like Lucien and Olivier died at the same time, and so most likely this was either a double homicide or a murder-suicide, and the primary theory as to what killed the two men was poison put in their food. And so police sent off the canned beans the two men were eating to this institution in Paris to test it for something called botulism, which is a deadly toxin that will grow inside of canned foods, but it came back negative. And then also police sent off the rest of the food the two men were eating to various other laboratories to be tested for poisons. And again, all of it came back negative. There was nothing that the police could detect in any of the food they ate. And so police were kind of confused for a minute, but then the autopsies came back for Olivier and Lucien, and everything changed. Lucien and Olivier were not murdered. This was not a murder-suicide. They didn't die from botulism or from some poison in their food. They died because of a set of very particular circumstances. Both Lucien and Olivier suffered from non-fatal minor medical issues. Lucien had bad dental health and so was missing a couple of teeth, and Olivier was suffering from a heart condition called cardiomegaly, which means his heart was slightly enlarged and somewhat fragile. However, his condition was totally being monitored by doctors and was under control. But just for a second, on the night of August 2nd, 2017, when Lucien and Olivier were having that cookout in Lucien's backyard, their non-fatal minor medical issues suddenly became a really, really big deal. Lucien cooked up a big plate of beef rib. Now, beef rib can be difficult to chew even when you have all your teeth and take your time, but Lucien was missing teeth and he loved this beef rib so much he was wolfing it down really quickly, and so he wasn't chewing it enough, and at some point he swallowed a particularly big unchewed bite and he began to choke. And when that happened, his best buddy, Olivier, sitting across from him, he stood up to try to help his friend who's basically dying right in front of him. And the stress of this moment caused his heart to seize up, his heart which is already enlarged and fragile, and he had a heart attack and died. And then Lucien, who now has no one to help him, continued to sit at the table trying to get this beef out of his throat, but he couldn't, and he eventually asphyxiated and died as well, hunched over at the table. A little after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 2007, three men launched a 35-foot white catamaran called the Caz 2 from a marina in northeastern Australia, kicking off what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. The captain of the Caz 2 was 56-year-old Des Batten, and for months he'd been training for this trip. And the two friends that Des was bringing with him on this trip were Jim Tunstead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's brother, Peter Tunstead, who was 69 years old. All three of the men had spent a lot of time plotting their actual course they'd be going on, which was from this marina on the northeastern side of Australia, up and around the north side, and then down the western coast to Perth, which was their final destination and where all three men lived. In total, this trip was supposed to take 8 weeks, and all three men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending an entire 2 months basically just drinking beers and fishing. Now, Des, Jim, and Peter were not the types to blow off responsibility to go party. I mean, they were devoted family men. All of them had been married for 30 plus years. Des had 2 kids, Jim had 4 kids, and Peter had 5 kids. But they were all either retired or nearing retirement, and this trip was going to be kind of a way to celebrate the end of an era. And while all three of them had gone on other big sailing trips, this one easily was the biggest one in terms of the distance they were covering and how much prep went into it and how expensive it was. I mean, this was like 10x the scope and scale of any other sailing trip they had done. And so, on April 15th, 2007, shortly after the three men had launched their boat and kicked off this big trip, Peter's wife would call him just to see how it was going. And she would say, you know, Peter was in great spirits and she could hear the other two men laughing in the background. And it sounded like they were about to start fishing and maybe have a couple of beers. And so it seemed very much to Peter's wife like this trip was going as well as it could be so far. And so eventually, Peter told his wife that he had to go, he told her he loved her, and then they hung up. Now, Des, who was the captain of the CAS-2, was adamant about safety being the top concern for this trip. Even though all three men were relatively healthy and had a lot of sailing experience, and even though Des was a member of a volunteer marine rescue group and so literally could be called on to go perform rescues at sea, despite all this experience and know-how, before they kicked off this trip, Des made Jim and Peter go through all these man overboard drills on the CAS-2 to make sure they knew how to do it if for some reason, an emergency arose out at sea. And so the men got really comfortable using all the life-saving equipment and going over all the procedures. And then also when they charted their course, Des stressed that at no point should they be sailing into open water. They needed to stay close to shore the whole time just because it was safer. And so when Jim began filming a video around 10 a.m. on the day they set sail for this trip, you can clearly see the shore in the background of this video, so they're following the course they had planned. But a couple of hours after Jim had shot that video on the day they left, a woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know Des, Jim, or Peter and had never seen the CAS-2 before, she was fishing in an area called Champagne Bay when she looked out into the water and she saw the CAS-2, a white 35-foot catamaran, sailing east to west across the horizon. And then at some point, as Isabel was watching this boat, which really meant nothing to her, she just happened to be watching it, she saw it make a quick 90-degree turn and began sailing out towards the open ocean away from the coastline. Now, remember, Isabel knows nothing of this boat or its occupants, and so has no idea that Des, Peter, and Jim had been so clear about at no point will we sail into the open ocean. It's too dangerous. Stay close to shore. She didn't know that. And so she just saw a ship turning and sailing out to the open water, and she thought, okay, whatever. So she didn't go and report what she saw. It was only later on when details emerged about what happened on the CAS-2 that she would later come forward and say, hey, I saw that boat and this is what they did. The next day, April 16th, two more people would spot the CAS-2. These were two men who also did not know Des, Peter, Jim. They didn't know CAS-2. They didn't know Isabel. In fact, these two men didn't know each other. But independently, on this day, they looked out near Champagne Bay and they saw the CAS-2 sailing east to west in the exact same spot that Isabel had seen it the day before. Now, remember, the CAS-2 was traveling from that marina on the northeast side of Australia all the way around to Perth. It was a point A to point B trip. There was no reason the CAS-2 would ever double back and be in the same place 24 hours later, but here we were 24 hours later, and two more people are seeing the CAS-2 in the same place that Isabel had seen it, and so that made no sense. But again, these two men who saw the CAS-2, they just saw it and thought nothing of it because they don't know anything about this boat. It wasn't until later that they eventually came forward with what they saw. Then, one more day after that, on April 17th, there were these fishermen that were out in their boats a little farther north of Champagne Bay, where Isabel and the two other men had seen the CAS-2 on consecutive days. And these fishermen, they spotted the CAS-2. And again, these fishermen do not know the CAS-2. They don't know its occupants. They're just seeing the ship. Except this time, the fishermen, when they saw the CAS-2, they thought something was wrong because they saw the CAS-2 from a distance navigating its way fairly close to shore in an area that these fishermen knew was full of coral reefs. It's a very dangerous area to be piloting any ship. In addition, the sail of the CAS-2 was totally ripped to shreds. And so the fishermen, they're looking at the ship, wondering what they're doing, but the pilot of the ship looked so in control as he's navigating his way through the coral reefs that the fishermen thought, okay, he knows what he's doing, so, leave him alone. But again, later on, they would report what they saw. It wasn't until the next day, April 18th, so 3 days after Des, Peter, and Jim had set sail, that anybody realized there was an issue with the crew of the CAS-2. Because on April 18th, a Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying over the Great Barrier Reef, and they looked down and they saw the CAS-2 with its badly damaged sails, piloting all around this very dangerous part of the water to be piloting. And so the crew on board the helicopter attempted to radio down to the CAS-2 to see if they were okay, but no one from the CAS-2 called back to the helicopter. And so as they're waiting for a response from the CAS-2, the helicopter crew is watching the pilot of the CAS-2 clearly, navigating the boat in between coral reefs. And it seemed like, despite the damage to the sails, he knew what he was doing. And so to the crew on the helicopter, this didn't really look like an emergency, but it seemed like something worth flagging. And so they called the Marine police and said, hey, we have this ship here that's not responding. We think they're okay, but you might want to come take a look. And so the Marine police, they would come out to the area where the helicopter had said they had seen the CAS-2, and when they got there, the CAS-2 was gone. At this point, the Marine police got some information about the boat, CAS-2, and discovered who owned the boat and who was on this trip, so Des, Peter, and Jim, and the police would get in touch with all of their families, and they would all tell police that besides Peter's wife, who talked to Peter on that morning they left, no one had heard from any of the men. They had gone totally silent since that first day. And so when police heard this, they knew this had to be some kind of emergency, and so a search was launched to find the CAS-2. And 48 hours later, a rescue helicopter that was part of the search was about 80 or so miles off the northeastern coast of Australia when they looked down and they spotted the CAS-2. And it still had all torn up sails, and it was kind of spinning listlessly in the water, and from the helicopter, they couldn't see anybody on board the ship. It was totally vacant on the deck. Now, at this point, authorities really have no idea what's going on with this boat or its occupants. It was possible that maybe they had been hijacked, and so Des, Peter, and Jim could be held hostage down below, along with the people that took them hostage. Or maybe the boat just got stolen, and Des, Peter, and Jim are not on this boat, and that it's just the criminals on board, and again, they're down below, hidden from view. So authorities, they don't know, but they decided to take a risk and just send somebody down to get on that boat and just see what was going on. So a rescue officer on board the rescue helicopter named Corey Benson was lowered by a rope where he was dropped into the water, and then Corey swam by himself over to the CAS-2 and he climbed up the side of the boat and he stepped onto the deck, and right away he noticed it was kind of like eerily quiet on board the boat. There was nobody he could see, and there was no sign of any disturbance, minus the sails of the ship being all tattered. And for a second, Corey thought about maybe calling out for Des, Peter, and Jim to see if they were down below and could come up and solve this mystery. But then he also worried that if he called out, there could be some bad people on board this boat, and he didn't want to draw their attention. And so Corey was quiet and just began walking towards the front of the boat. And as he did, he began to notice signs that people must have recently been on board this boat doing normal things. Like, for example, there was a fishing rod that was cast out into the water that was anchored to a post on the side of the boat that looked like it had just been operated minutes ago. There was a blue mug of coffee that was just sitting on a table that looked like maybe someone had been drinking from it recently. There was a neatly folded t-shirt on another chair with a set of glasses on them. I mean, there was just all these kind of tells that this was a boat that was being used recently. And when Corey actually got to the front of the boat where the captain would stand, he saw the engine was actually still on. It was idling. And so Corey turned it off. Now, at this point, Corey knew his next step was going down the stairs and opening up the door that led into the cabin down below to see if Des, Peter, and Jim were down there. But he also knew when he went down there, despite there being backup up in the helicopter and more people making their way out here, Corey would be all alone if there were criminals or bad people down there. But this was his job, and so after taking a deep breath, he turned and walked down the few steps, and he got to the door that led to the cabin. He grabbed the handle and he opened it up. And the room he was walking into was kind of like a half living room, half kitchen area. And he saw there was this table, and on it was a newspaper that was dated April 15th. So the day the CAS set sail. And then on the wall behind the newspaper was a calendar where days had been marked off all the way through April 14th. April 15th was not marked off. But also nearby on a table was a computer that was still plugged in and on and looked very much like someone had just been using it. And also there were plates of food that were out that didn't look that old, that also seemed like people must have just been eating from them. And then also Corey could see past this common area into the bedroom, and very obviously the bunks inside of there had been slept in. And so basically everything seemed like it was where it should be. There was just one problem. Des, Peter, and Jim were not on this ship. There was no sign of where they were. They were just gone. and there was nobody else on board the ship. It was just completely abandoned with no sign of what happened. Des, Jim, and Peter were never found, and so we have no idea what actually happened to them. Nor do we have any idea why they were seen by Isabel and the two men and the fishermen doing all these weird things, like randomly piloting out towards open water, which totally went against their plan, which was stay close to shore, be safe. Or, why on that second day they were seen in the same spot near Champagne Bay, indicating they had doubled back after going towards open water. That went against their plan, which was point A to point B. Why are they doubling back around? And so unfortunately, this whole thing is just one big mystery that has yet to be solved. Since you made it to the end of this video, I think it's safe to assume that you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. And so if that's true, this is your reminder that we actually have a brand new weekly show, a podcast, that's free and available on every platform right now. It's called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, and it's definitely a strange, dark, and mysterious show like you've come to expect, but obviously the focus of the show is medical mysteries. From bizarre, unheard of diseases to miraculous recoveries to strange medical mishaps and unexplained deaths, and all of them have big plot twists at the end. The first 8 episodes of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries are out right now on every platform, and this Tuesday coming up, another 8 episodes are going to be released on Amazon Music. Or if you listen on other podcast platforms like Apple or Spotify or whatever, you will continue to get one new episode of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries every Tuesday. And if all this was not enough to convince you to at least go check out MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, then hopefully this sneak peek of episode number 9, called Sleep Addict, releasing this Tuesday, will push you over the edge. After you listen to the sneak peek, be sure to go follow and turn on all notifications for MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Here is the sneak peek of episode number 9, Sleep Addict. On the morning of July 30th, 1976, a young doctor examined an elderly veteran at Bloomsburg Hospital in Pennsylvania, desperately looking for a way to keep this man alive. His lungs were filling up with fluid, but no matter how many times the doctor drained them, the fluid just kept coming back. The man suddenly began to spasm in his bed, coughing up a bloody pink froth. Dr. Ernest Campbell tried to stay calm, but he knew he was running out of options. He'd seen people die from respiratory failure before, but this had progressed faster and more suddenly than anything he'd ever experienced. And this patient was only one of several in the hospital with the same disturbing symptoms. In fact, Dr. Campbell had heard about similar cases appearing across the entire state, and so he was terrified that this was the onset of a deadly epidemic. And if it was, there might be no way to stop it. Thank you for listening. Now go check out MrBallen's Medical Mysteries wherever you get your podcasts. It's free, new episodes every week. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's stories, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, which has hundreds more stories just like these, but many of them are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. Today, we have 2 stories that are each about people who really craved attention or status. But instead of getting that, they got carnage. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to get new tires for the Like Button's car. But don't tell them you're replacing their regular tires with monster truck tires. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in early September of 2004, 20-year-old Derek Keeper sat at a desk in the newspaper lab at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln furiously typing on one of the school's desktop computers. The lab that Derek was in was the hub of the university's school paper, the Daily Nebraskan. So there were some other students who were in the space that were talking or working at other computers. But Derek didn't notice any of them. He was completely locked in on what he was doing and writing as fast as he could. Because after he was done with the article that he was working on, he had a ton of other responsibilities that he needed to tackle. So Derek was involved in a lot of stuff at school. He was in a fraternity, he was a senator in the student government, he was a research assistant for the library, and he was pursuing 5 different majors. And Derek took all of his various commitments very, very seriously. But the column he was currently writing was really the one he had the most fun with. So Derek was from a small city in Nebraska, and even though he'd always been, personally a very loud and opinionated person, he'd never had a real platform for talking about all the ideas and points of views that he had. And so this column really gave him the opportunity to finally, actually present these big ideas to the students at school, and he hoped would likely provoke lively discussions around campus about his ideas. After all, Derek loved a good debate, and so he would intentionally choose to write about really complex issues that would get his readers fired up, like the ongoing war in Iraq and the future of the Republican Party and all the things that were wrong with local politics. The tone he went for when he wrote and talked about these kind of, contentious things was often very sarcastic, very blunt, and provocative. He really thrived on creating discourse and getting people to passionately disagree with him. And they usually definitely did, to the point where some even would get very mad with him. A lot of times the paper's readers would write furious letters or even send hate mail about what Derek had written. But Derek was really not bothered by that at all. In some ways, that was his aim, to get people all riled up. And he was sure that the article he was writing right now was going to be even more divisive than really anything else he had written. For Derek, though, really for him, it was all about individual freedoms and encouraging people to say no to government overreach in their daily lives. That really was sort of his general stance on everything. That's really what inspired him to do any of this in the first place. In fact, this particular column that Derek was writing was about how he was advocating for abolishing a set of state and federal laws that were trying to control personal choice and the right to decide what was best for one's body, and he was against it. Now, to be clear, the stakes for this issue were life and death, literally. But Derek believed that the fundamental freedom of being an American was the right to make your own decisions, even if it meant risking your own personal safety. And so as Derek sort of furiously typed away, he was encouraging everyone, like senators and politicians, everybody, to have the same kind of intensity that he had about this issue, to be just fully bought in on this idea of, as Americans, we need individual freedom. And then finally, when he was all done typing, Derek sat back and proofread the whole thing, and when he got to the last line, he got chills. It said, quote, "I just wish we could keep the government out of our pocketbooks and out of our personal decisions." Derek loved that line, and so he nodded, satisfied with his work. He had nailed it. Then he emailed his draft to his editor with a big smile on his face. Derek's article went to print just a few days later, on September 17th. And like most of Derek's other articles, this one for sure got a lot of angry emails and letters from people who disagreed with what Derek had to say. But all the vitriol in these messages just proved to Derek that his article had clearly been a success. He had sparked outrage and got people talking about this issue. Derek even hoped that maybe some of the readers got angry enough to actually take action. That's what he wanted. He wanted his writing to genuinely inspire. The rest of Derek's semester was a total blur. He kept writing his weekly column on top of all of his other obligations and exams and everything else, and before he knew it, the semester was over, and he was headed to his mother's house in Texas for Christmas break. A few weeks later, on January 4th, 2005, at 3 a.m., Derek rode in the back seat of a Ford Explorer SUV on his way back to school after the break. He'd caught a ride from his mother's home in Texas with two of his fraternity brothers who were sitting up front. And Derek had spent the first part of this just awful 13-hour-long drive doing what he did best, using his sarcasm to make his friends laugh, and he was also engaging them in really animated conversations. And so, the first 6 to 8 hours had sort of flown by.
But now, it's basically the middle of the night still, / very early morning, and everybody had just gone quiet because they were all exhausted from this truly awful, long drive. All any of them wanted to do at this point was just get back to campus and be done. And eventually, Derek and his friends were very close to campus. They were finally in Nebraska, and they were driving down Interstate 80, which was a snowy, cold highway not far from the school. And Derek was really excited to start the new semester. He'd had a nice, laid-back holiday where he'd caught up on sleep and spent a lot of time just kind of hanging out and seeing his younger siblings. But Derek just was not the kind of person who liked slowing down for very long. And so he was quite eager to get back to his busy life on campus. Especially, he really wanted to get back to his column. He had had a lot of downtime and was able to, brainstorm and come up with some good potential new topics for the column. But he really wasn't sure if any of those ideas were going to top the very controversial article that he had published back in September. People were still talking about that one. And Derek was still thinking about it too. In fact, his own words and advice to his readers were still ringing in his ears and guiding his everyday decisions. But for now, Derek just leaned his head up against the cold glass window of the car and waited for this long trip to finally be over. But suddenly, he felt the SUV lurch. And before he knew what was happening, he heard a deafening bang and he heard his friends screaming. Just minutes later, a police officer was flying down Interstate 80 in his cruiser. Eventually, he spotted a group of ambulances parked on the side of the road, and he knew that's where he needed to go, so he pulled over to the side and stopped. And when he got out, he saw in a ditch just off the highway was an overturned SUV. The officer immediately jumped out of his cruiser and rushed towards the vehicle. And when he got there, he found the scene was just absolutely chaotic. There were a team of paramedics who were at the window of the SUV trying to assess the condition of the victims inside and to get them out. And when the officer kneeled down to look inside as well, he could clearly see 2 people inside the vehicle. Now, both of them seemed basically fine beyond, obviously being in a wreck. I mean, they were banged up and clearly dazed, but their injuries didn't look immediately life-threatening. So, sort of relieved, the officer backed away to let the paramedics do their thing. But very quickly, the officer noticed that more paramedics were actually running past the SUV to something on the ground a few feet beyond it. And so the officer followed them to go see what it was they were running to. And when he saw what was on the ground, the officer just kind of stopped and knew instinctively that there was nothing anybody could do. I mean, there was a body of a young man on the ground who clearly was a third passenger of this SUV, but their body was just mangled almost beyond recognition. It would turn out Derek had been right. His September 17th, highly contentious column in the Daily Nebraskan would be his most controversial and famous piece ever. And actually, people are still talking about it today. Because his column was about how, we, all us Americans, reserve the right to make our own choices about our bodies and personal safety. And Derek believed that there was a law that was actually directly infringing on that right, which was the law that was forcing people to wear a seatbelt. Derek despised this requirement. He thought seatbelts should be just a personal decision about safety. To him, it was not just about buckling up, it was about individual choice, about freedom. And on January 4th, that SUV that Derek was riding in going back to school, well, the driver hit some ice on the road and lost control. The driver and the other passenger in the front were wearing seatbelts. But Derek, in keeping with his beliefs, was not. And so when the SUV crashed and flipped over, Derek alone was killed. As one reporter pointed out, Derek lived by his beliefs, and he also died by them. Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the West Coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you gotta act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballenstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all-expenses-paid-for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. That is fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, January 13th, 2012, 51-year-old Francesco Scatino and his girlfriend, Dominica, sat at a table in a crowded restaurant at a resort in Italy. And they'd been there for a while, having a leisurely meal. So their table was covered with empty dishes, a wine decanter, and plates with the remnants of their amazing food. Now, having an extended, indulgent dinner like this one was not technically allowed, since Francesco was actually working. But Francesco was not too worried about breaking what he considered to be a small rule, because he was not just some hired hand. I mean, he was in charge of this entire resort on Italy's Tuscan coast. And the resort was amazing. It was literally right out on the water and had thousands of guest rooms and 6 restaurants with over a dozen bars, a theater, multiple swimming pools, and there was even a casino. So it had really a huge capacity for guests. And right now, there were easily more than 3,000 people staying at this resort. And Francesco was, very proud to be the boss of this place, this unbelievable place. He actually had started working at this resort as a security guard, but he'd worked his way up to the very top. And now he'd been overseeing this property for about 6 years. And being a leader really worked well for his personality, because he loved being impressive and feeling important. He'd heard staff and former coworkers complain about how he was too over the top and a bit of a show-off, so he had heard those things. But Francesco knew that really these people, they were just jealous. He was handsome, he had a great job, and he had 2 just beautiful, amazing women in his life when, some people didn't have any. And so now Francesco smiled at one of his girlfriends, Dominica, who sat across the table from him and enjoying the dessert they were sharing. Francesco was married, but recently, Dominica had become the most important woman in his life. She was a dancer, and to him, she was just perfect. They'd only met a few weeks ago, so they were still in the honeymoon phase, where they were both still very flirtatious and eager to impress one another. And so right now, Francesco knew he should leave and get back to his managing duties. But he was having so much fun with Dominica, so he lingered, eating his dessert as slowly as he could. But as he sat there, slow playing his dessert, he realized, their night together didn't actually have to end just because the dinner was over. There was something he could do right now that would give them maybe another hour or so together. And it would also completely blow Dominica away and prove to her just how amazing he really was. So, suddenly with a big smile on his face, he told Dominica to hurry up, finish eating, because they needed to get upstairs immediately. A few minutes later, Francesco and Dominica hurried into the resort's top floor operations center. And just like the entire rest of the place, this room, despite being an operations center, was still just massively impressive. In addition to all the very new age, high-speed monitors and security feeds and maps all over the room, there was this huge window that overlooked this balcony, this exterior balcony, that looked down on the ocean. It was like this beautiful view of the ocean, and it even overlooked a stretch of small seaside villages called Giglio. This room was also filled with all of Francesco's employees hustling around and, staring at screens and talking on headsets. But as soon as Francesco and Dominica walked in there, Francesco kind of went to the center of the room and kind of got everybody's attention and told them all to listen up. Then he went over the details of his big idea. The resort was going to put on a very specific and spectacular kind of show called a salute. And they were going to do it right now. So salutes were very popular in this area of Italy, and Francesco's resort actually did them all the time, so this was not totally unusual. They were basically kind of a performance, mostly for the locals, where the resort would flash all of its lights and play music, while guests of the resort would go to their balconies and wave and cheer to the residents and the other tourists in Giglio. But critically, salutes needed to be both quick and highly choreographed. That's really the only way they worked. And so in order for a salute to work, it really required the attention and active participation from a large number of people. I mean, this was a big to-do. And so given the fact that these were sort of a big endeavor, it meant that, something could go wrong if you're not really careful. And Francesco actually had a mentor who'd actively discouraged him to not do these salutes or try to do as few as you can because of the fact that things could go wrong. But Francesco's mentor was not physically here right now to tell Francesco to stop. And the people that were here were pretty excited about his idea. So Francesco began going over the plan with his staff. And as he expected, with such a complicated undertaking, there were a lot of logistics to look over. However, when Francesco actually started going about these preparations, he realized he couldn't actually read anything because he didn't have his glasses on. He didn't think he looked handsome with them on, so he hadn't brought them out to dinner with Dominica, but now he really needed them. But thinking on his feet, Francesco simply asked a staff member to read him whatever information he really needed to know in order to do this salute. And so the staff member did as they were told, and at the end of it, Francesco felt like he had heard what he needed to hear and he thought everything was in order, and so he nodded and said, "Okay, we are all set to begin." And then he looked over at Dominica and smiled and sort of nodded like, "Okay, here we go." Then she knew whatever was coming next was going to be really, really special. When Francesco gave the actual order to begin the salute, everybody in the operations room jumped into action. And as soon as the actual salute began, Francesco squinted out the huge window that looked out over the ocean and Giglio down below, and Francesco was just so excited when he thought about how everyone who was out and about in town would look up and see his palace all lit up and full of life and energy. But as he peered at the lights of Giglio, he realized something wasn't quite right. Even without his glasses on, he could see that there was something outside in the darkness, just barely illuminated by the town's lights. It was a large shape right between the resort and Giglio. And to his horror, Francesco realized it was actually getting closer, fast. At the same time, but on the other side of the resort, an American man named Brian Aho was eating dinner with his wife and teenage daughter at the Milano restaurant, which was one of 6 restaurants in the resort. And they'd just been enjoying their meal when there was this deafening banging sound, and the entire room gave a huge jolt and everything inside just sort of went flying. Brian grabbed the table to brace himself as plates and glasses shot off the table and shattered everywhere. And then he heard screams and people hitting the ground all around him as diners were literally being thrown from their chairs. And then there was another series of crashes when some ceiling panels fell from above and smashed onto the ground. But then it was over. The shaking abruptly stopped, and Brian immediately jumped up to make sure that his wife and daughter were okay, and they did seem fine, just dazed like everybody else in the room. As Brian stood up, he could tell he was, mostly okay, also shaken up. But the overwhelming thought was just having no idea what had just happened. I mean, he's looking around and no one seemed to know. It had felt like some kind of earthquake or something. But then Brian thought, if this had been an earthquake, he really had to get his family out of this restaurant immediately in case of aftershocks. But it seemed like all the other diners clearly had the same idea, because before Brian could actually move, there was a surge of activity around him as dozens of people just began rushing towards the exit of the restaurant. And Brian didn't want him or his family to get caught in the middle of this huge crowd. Huge amounts of people running in the exact same direction, a panicked group of people, could easily create a stampede. And he was worried that he and his family could get pulled to the ground and trampled in the chaos. So he looked around and he saw on the other side of the restaurant there was a smaller door that nobody else was going to. So he and his family began making their way over to it. But before they could actually get through this door, the overhead lights began to flicker and then went out. And then with the darkness, suddenly came the blast of emergency alarms echoing through the resort. And then he could hear more screams, not just inside of this restaurant, but sort of all over the place. It was like the resort had devolved into madness. Brian had never been more scared in his whole life. I mean, his pulse was racing faster than he thought was even possible, and he almost felt paralyzed, like this was just too much to even process. He also, like basically everybody else, had no clue what was going on here. But I mean, navigating his family through an emergency was already going to be horrifying and terrifying and dangerous, but now he would also have to do it in the dark. For a moment, Brian and his family just stood there, kind of frozen in the dark. And then Brian was about to tell his family to just go through the door, we'll figure it out in the dark. But then luckily, the emergency lights came on, giving the room sort of a dim, eerie glow. But it was enough to sort of guide their way. And so at that point, Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his wife and his daughter, pushed through the side door, and headed out into the hallway. It would take nearly 10 minutes for Brian and his family to navigate the maze of hallways they had just walked into until finally they stepped outside and were in the open air. But when they finally got out there, Brian realized they actually had a really big problem, because the exit they had just taken had taken them not to safety. It had led them to this expansive outdoor terrace with a railing on the 4th floor of the resort, which meant they still needed to get down multiple levels in order to, evacuate safely. But just the fact they were on the 4th floor was not the big issue. The big issue was the terrace was clearly packed with other people from the resort who were also trying to evacuate. There was all these people basically blocking their way. So basically, everybody who has no idea what's going on is just like pushing and shoving each other, and there were no authority figures or any staff around to actually direct what now was basically an evacuation. And Brian could tell that the crowd was clearly starting to panic, and really he was too. Everybody was just like, what's happening here? And so Brian was about to suggest to his family that they try to find another way out when they heard the crackling of the resort's public speaker system, and a voice came on that finally delivered some information about what was happening. It said that there had been an electrical blackout, but everything was fine, and technicians were hard at work trying to fix the problem. So in the meantime, all the guests should stay calm and just go to their rooms for safety. And at this point, it was very obvious that the mood all around Brian and his family completely changed. People stopped pushing and arguing and panicking, and Brian himself felt that knot of dread in his stomach sort of loosen a bit. I mean, an electrical blackout didn't seem like a life or death situation, so he, and clearly everybody else, felt a whole lot less scared. Pretty much right away, many of the guests began heading back inside, making their way to their rooms. And Brian actually spotted a few staff members who were in the crowd, encouraging people to do just that, go back to your rooms. And so for a few moments, Brian and his family and the others just kind of stayed put and just kind of let things play out, kind of watching things settle back into normal. But then it was like with no warning, there was this other huge banging sound, and the floor once again buckled under Brian's feet. And this triggered a whole new wave of just absolute chaos out on this terrace. All at once, everybody started shouting and pushing each other in pure panic. And at the same time, there were all these new announcements coming out frantically over the loudspeaker, but it wasn't doing anything. It was like the crowd had decided something bad is happening and no one can tell me otherwise. I have to leave. Everybody is just trying to evacuate all at once. And so pretty much right at this point, you had a group of people who were out on the terrace who decided to charge into the resort to try to find another way to evacuate. And also you had the group of people who had already gone back inside to go back to their rooms, who had changed their mind, who charged right back out, back onto the terrace. And so for a moment, it was like these two pools of people kind of smashing into each other, and Brian and his family were kind of off to the side because they had just barely stepped out onto the terrace when all of this stuff was happening. But then Brian watched in complete shock as he saw some of the people, after they pushed through all the way to the edge of the terrace to the railing, they began climbing over the railing to climb down from the 4th floor. Seeing this was horrifying for Brian, but then he felt yet another shudder under his feet and a loud industrial groaning sound from the resort right behind him, and he knew if he didn't do what these people were doing, he and his family might not be able to evacuate. Clearly, there was a real problem. They didn't know what it was, but they had to go. So he grabbed his wife and his daughter's hands, he shoved his way through the crowd to the railing, over the railing they went, and down they began to climb. Meanwhile, back up in the top-level operations center, Francesco was staring out the room's huge window, just completely frozen in shock. His resort was in complete pandemonium. Below, guests were running, others were fighting and shoving, and some were literally leaping to their potential deaths from the upper level balconies and terraces. And so as Francesco watched all of this carnage, he tried to wrap his head around how the night had gone so horrifically wrong. The worst part of all of it was there was absolutely no way to fix it. He'd been trying to show Dominica and everybody else how amazing and impressive and in control he was. But he'd completely lost control of this whole situation. And he'd also lost his girlfriend because Dominica had quickly fled the resort. And then there was a loud crashing sound somewhere in the distance, and his heart pounded, and he realized it was time for him to start running too. Minutes later, Francesco and some of his staff sprinted through the halls of the resort. And as they ran, thunderous noises and bangs came from every direction, and debris from the ceiling and walls crashed to the ground all around them as they were shaken loose. And all the while, over the noise, Francesco could hear the continuous shrieks of panic from people who were still clearly trapped inside the resort and just couldn't get out. But he and the others he was with finally did make it to the exit. And this exit was not overrun with panicking people. So Francesco was lucky enough to be able to pretty quickly make it to the bottom level and then keep on going. And he did not look back, not until he was far away and definitely to safety. But when he did finally stop running, and he did turn around and looked back at his resort, his stomach pitched so hard he nearly vomited. Because finally, he could see right in front of him the full horrible extent of what he had done. It would turn out what Francesco was looking at was the culmination of a record number of terrible choices he had made that night. 1. Francesco would later deny this, but he was seen drinking alcohol at dinner while he was supposed to be working. 2. He was not wearing his glasses, which meant he was his most handsome self, but also that he couldn't see very well. And 3. He was distracted by his new girlfriend, who he had brought to an area where only key personnel were allowed because he was desperate to impress her. Now, in most workplaces, this would all just be considered unprofessional and maybe might get you fired. But in Francesco's workplace, it was much worse than that. What he had done was incredibly dangerous because the resort that Francesco managed was not a regular hotel. It was a gigantic cruise ship called the Costa Concordia. Francesco was its captain, and when he issued the order for the boat to do a salute, he was not just ordering a complicated but entertaining show. A cruise ship salute also involves steering the massive boat much closer to shore than usual to appropriately show off to the locals on land. But because Francesco literally couldn't see very well, was obviously distracted and possibly drunk, he didn't notice that when they did this salute, they were going way too fast and way too close to shore. That shape he saw rushing towards them in the darkness was an enormous cluster of rocks. By the time he saw it, it was too late. The Concordia had smashed into the rocks, tearing a 230-foot wide hole in the hull, which immediately flooded the ship. And then making matters even worse, Francesco delayed rescue efforts for more than an hour by trying to convince people that what had happened was just an electrical outage. And then when he finally did issue an evacuation order, he broke a sacred rule for ship captains. He fled the boat before the remainder of his crew and the passengers. Like he was the first one off. He did not go down with his ship. That American passenger, Brian Aho, and his family would survive, because after they decided to go over the railing, they, perilously climbed down 4 levels all the way to a lifeboat, and so they survived. But unfortunately, 32 other people who were on board the boat ultimately died, all because of Francesco's desire to show off. Francesco himself was ultimately arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He was subsequently named Italy's most hated man. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once or twice a week. So if that's of interest to you, please log on to the Like Button's Netflix account and fast forward all of their continue watching shows approximately 2 or 3 minutes. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. Located on the far northern tip of Maine, right on the border of Canada, lies a small rural town called Van Buren. Van Buren is home to about 2,000 people who, for the most part, have lived in Maine for their entire lives, and they tend to be very rugged and very competent people. But unless you live in Van Buren or know someone in Van Buren or have family out there, there's no reason you would have heard of this particular town. Nothing really happens in this town, at least nothing that makes headlines. However, that would change. In 2019, Van Buren made international headlines because of one man, Ronald Sear. As a young man in the 1950s, Ronald Sear joined the Air Force and fought in the Korean War. And then after he got out of the military, he moved back to his hometown of Van Buren, Maine, and he moved into a very modest 2-story home right near town. And for a little while, he just kind of floated about, didn't really have a direction in life. But eventually, because of his love for working with his hands and his general skill at working with his hands and building things, he started a small but successful tool selling company that he ran right out of his shed on his property. Fast forward to 2019, Ronald Sear at that time was 65 years old and he still lived in the same property right near town in Van Buren. However, he now lived alone and he still ran this tool selling business right out of his work shed. And for Ronald, this was enough. He was very content with his life. He was very happy. But that year, he would face a crisis. One bright, sunny morning in the summer of that year, Ronald left his house and he walked over to his shed. He went inside, and right away he noticed something. Ronald kept all these bins inside of his shed that were full of all of the different tools that he would sell. And because he was in there all the time, either literally selling tools or tinkering with whatever it was he was building himself, he was very aware of how full each of these bins were. And anytime they got low, he would order more so he had enough supply to sell. And so he went into his shed this morning and he noticed right away that a couple of the bins appeared to be a little bit lower than he remembered. And right away, Ronald is thinking, did I forget to order supplies to fill these bins up? Did I just forget to do that? But he's thinking to himself, I am meticulous in making sure my inventory is full at all times. I've been doing this for decades. And so it can't be me. Maybe I took the tools and I brought them into my house and I've left them in there, or maybe they're in my truck. And so Ronald, believing there's a totally logical explanation for this, would leave his shed and he would search his property, but he can't find these tools anywhere. And so he began calling his family and his friends to see if, maybe they had come by and borrowed some of these tools, or maybe they knew what had happened to them. But everyone he spoke to said, no, I have no idea. And so by that afternoon, Ronald had found himself back inside of his work shed looking around, thinking to himself, have I been robbed? It was the only logical thing he could think of that would explain this loss. And so Ronald drove to the police station and he spoke to police and he explained what happened. But unfortunately, the police's reaction to what he was telling them was not exactly what he wanted. They basically assumed that, he just had miscounted, that in reality, the tools were either still in the shed and then he just forgot how many were supposed to be in there, or he had just kind of lost them on his property somewhere, that they were bound to turn up. And so the police told him, look, Ronald, go back and search your property. I'm sure they're there. And if you get some proof that someone actually stole from you, then come back to us. And so Ronald was really annoyed by this. He wanted them to take this seriously, but he could tell they just were not going to. And so Ronald drove back to his house. He went inside, he hopped on his computer, and he began researching what other homeowners did to protect themselves from things like theft. And one of the things he came across was setting up tripwires all around the perimeter of your property. Basically, you take these thin wires and you stretch them out very tight, very low to the ground, and you anchor them on each side, and then on the wire tripwire itself, you hang little bells. And so in theory, if an intruder were to walk onto your property, they would most likely not see the tripwires on the ground and they would kick them, and that would cause the bells to ring, thereby alerting the homeowner of their presence. Ronald loved this idea, so he went out and he set up tripwires all around his property. But over the next several days, after these wires were stood up, none of the wires made any sound, and still more tools continued to go missing. This was also in spite of the fact that his shed was locked at night. And so Ronald's thinking to himself, whoever's doing this is clearly watching me and kind of monitoring what I'm doing. They must be aware of the tripwires, and they must be sneaking into the shed, at some time that I have the doors unlocked. I mean, this is a professional thief. And so as Ronald is thinking about this master thief that is targeting him, he has this sudden fear that if he can't stop this person from breaking into his shed and taking his tools, how can he possibly protect himself against this person breaking into his home and stealing things from in there, which included all of his cash and many other valuables? And so Ronald became very fearful and decided the only thing he could do was really beef up his home security system. And so he hopped back online and he began Googling other ways to protect your property. And after discovering a number of really effective techniques, he got to work. He began building all these home defense systems and placing them all around his property. And after all of these kind of DIY security measures were put up, the theft of his tools stopped. And in Ronald's mind, that validated that his defense system had worked. He was effectively preventing theft. But this would not be the end of his troubles. Fast forward to Thanksgiving that year, so November 28th, and the Van Buren police got a very frantic phone call from Ronald. He was totally hysterical, he wasn't really making sense, and the police, they tried to understand what was going on, but all they could get from Ronald was that he was requesting police to come to his residence immediately. And so the police, they hang up and they're thinking, okay, we know Ronald was dealing with a potential thief. Maybe he literally caught the thief red-handed and he wants us to come and arrest this person, and who knows, maybe they're fighting at his residence right now. And so the police speed over to Ronald's house, they pull into his driveway, and at first glance, nothing looks out of the ordinary. Ronald's truck is in the driveway, and there's no obvious signs of a disturbance, but they notice the front door to Ronald's house is wide open. And so the police park their cars in Ronald's driveway, they get out and they run up onto the front porch, and they're standing in front of this open door, and they look down and they can see there's a very obvious blood trail starting from the front of Ronald's house, going straight back down a hallway that looped around to the left and out of sight. And so right away, the police are yelling into the house, Ronald, are you okay? What's going on? And somewhere deep inside of the house, they hear what sounds like Ronald make a kind of guttural sound. And so immediately this tips the police that more than likely Ronald has been hurt, and he likely is the one who made this blood trail. And so the police draw their guns and they go inside of Ronald's house, not really sure what they're going to find. They don't know if there's some intruder or attacker or someone in here that's harmed Ronald, but they make their way down this hall following the blood trail. They turn the corner, and then sitting at the end of the blood trail is Ronald. He's sitting down with his back to some cabinets in the kitchen, and he's clutching his midsection. He is covered in blood. He's completely pale. And so right away, the officers call in backup, but then as a security measure, they search the rest of the first floor to make sure there is no other person here. There was no one on the first floor. They went to the second floor. They peeked around up there. They didn't see anyone. So they rushed back down to Ronald, who's still just sitting there, and they begin administering first aid, and they're trying to get him to explain what happened. How did you get hurt? But Ronald is clearly in shock. He's kind of in a daze. He's not making sense. And then by the time the paramedics showed up just a couple of minutes later, Ronald had slipped into unconsciousness. When Ronald was wheeled out of the house, the responding officers and the backup officers, who by now had arrived, decided to search the rest of Ronald's house to see if there was some clue as to what had happened. And so they began searching in the kitchen, looking around, but there wasn't anything that stood out to them. And then they began walking around towards the living room. And when they got into the living room, one of the officers suddenly screamed to everyone inside to stop where they were, stop moving. It would turn out Ronald, as part of his very beefed up home security system, had installed various booby traps all around his property, including inside of his house. And some of these traps were gun booby traps. traps. The officer that had yelled for everyone to stop had spotted one of these traps. He saw a handgun anchored to the ceiling aimed at the front door, and there was a string attached to the trigger that was also then attached to the doorknob of the front door. And so if this trap were live and some person opened the front door, it would activate this trap, causing the gun to shoot them. And so clearly, Ronald had accidentally left this particular booby trap on, and he had accidentally activated it, shooting himself. And so after the officer sees this gun anchored to the ceiling, he tells everyone, and they begin looking up and just looking around to see if there are other traps. And amazingly, there are. In other doorways, just from where they're standing, they can see the barrels of guns pointing down that are obvious booby traps. In their haste to get in there and figure out what was going on, they hadn't noticed all of these guns in the ceiling, and so it was just kind of a miracle that none of the other traps had been set off. Ronald would be rushed to the hospital that night, but he would pass away from his wound. His death would be ruled an accident, and to this day, we don't know if he really was dealing with a professional thief that was stealing his tools, or if it was just a figment of his imagination. Mary Cerruti had a difficult childhood. Growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s in Houston, Texas, Mary's family barely had enough money to get by. And then by the time Mary was 21, both of her parents had passed away, leaving her with nothing. After their deaths, Mary kind of bounced around Houston, going from one low-paying job to the next, and then eventually she met a man that she fell madly in love with, and they got married, but unfortunately that marriage would end in divorce. After Mary got over that heartbreak, she would meet another man who she would also fall in love with, and they would get married too, but like her first marriage, this one also ended in divorce. At this point, Mary was so devastated by yet another heartbreak that she just kind of accepted that she was not gonna get married again. She was not gonna have a family of her own. But she didn't let this get her down. Instead, she kind of embraced her life as a loner. Fast forward to 2015, and Mary was 61 years old, and she was still living alone. She lived in a small home in a Houston neighborhood. This neighborhood, over the last several decades, had really begun to grow. Lots of new apartment complexes were being built all the time, and in fact, one of the apartment developers had approached Mary and offered to buy her house so they could build over her land, but she had refused because she loved her house. She did not want to sell it. It didn't matter what they offered her. And so she was the only house in this long stretch of apartment buildings that didn't sell. But Mary kind of liked it. She wrote in her diary that her bungalow was like a castle, and all these apartment buildings all around her were her castle walls. Mary didn't really have much contact with other people. She didn't have a consistent job, so she didn't have relationships with coworkers. She didn't have much contact, if any, with her living family, and she really didn't have any friends, with the exception of one woman who was in town who owned an arts and crafts shop, who Mary would periodically go into town and say hello to. But despite all that, Mary was not lonely. She had lots and lots of cats, and she loved cats. Anytime she saw a stray cat out in the neighborhood, Mary would get the cat food and water, and then eventually would try to coax the cat to come into her house. And then when it did, she would win the cat's trust, and then she would give it a place to live, and she would feed it and take care of it. And so before long, she had dozens of cats living in the house with her. And so these cats kind of became Mary's best friends, and so she rarely left the house, if ever. She mostly just stayed in the house with them. In February of that year, one of Mary's neighbors happened to be walking by her property, and they looked over and they saw a stack of mail had grown on her front porch, indicating that Mary had not opened her door to get her mail. And this neighbor also noticed that while Mary's property did tend to get a little bit overgrown with the trees and the grass, it was exceptionally overgrown, like no one was even trying to take care of it. And so this neighbor was concerned that maybe something had happened to Mary, and so they opened up her fence, they walked across the yard, they went up onto the porch, and they knocked on the front door, but it was silent. And so this neighbor kind of leaned over and looked in the window that was just to the left of the door to see if maybe they could look inside, but there was a curtain drawn across that window, so they couldn't see anything. And so the neighbor tried knocking on the door one more time, but again, met with silence. And so after standing there for a minute, the neighbor left the front porch and walked around to the side of the house to see if maybe they could look in one of those windows, but when they went around to the side, those windows were covered with curtains too. So the neighbor walked back to the front of the property and just stood there looking at the house, wondering what they should do. And something told them that something's off, something's wrong, someone needs to make sure Mary really is okay, someone needs to get inside of this house. And so the neighbor called the Houston police and explained the situation. A few minutes later, the Houston police arrived, and they too went right up onto Mary's porch. They knocked on her door. It was met with silence. And so after that, the police talked to one of the other neighbors and got a key that Mary had apparently given them previously. And the police went back to Mary's front door. They used the key. They unlocked the door. They opened it up, and right away they were hit with this horrible smell coming from inside the house. The police pushed the door the rest of the way open, and they stepped inside and they yelled out for Mary, but it was silent. And then before the police even began walking around looking for her, they looked off to their left and the right inside of the house, and they saw there were all these dead cats all over the ground. And so the Houston police didn't know what happened to Mary, but right away they're thinking, okay, we've seen scenarios like this before where someone who lives alone that no one really checks on dies unexpectedly, and then when they pass away, all of their pets are trapped in the house, they're not getting fed, and so they pass away too. And so the police at this point are fully expecting to find Mary's dead body somewhere in the house. And so they begin walking through the house looking for it. But after searching the house top to bottom, they could not find Mary. And so the police leave Mary's house, and at this point there are people outside gathered because they see the police cars. And so the police grabbed a couple of the neighbors and they asked them, do you know anything about this woman? Did she say anything about where she was going? Did you see her leave at any point? And the consensus amongst the neighbors they spoke to was that Mary basically kept to herself. She did not travel. She didn't go anywhere. She mostly just stayed in her house with her cats. And so it was very unlikely that she would have just abandoned the property and abandoned her cats because she loved them so much. And so the police at this point are thinking, okay, she's got to be in this house somewhere. And so the police called a few more officers to the property, and the group went back inside of Mary's house, and they really looked for Mary, thinking that, maybe she slipped into a closet and that's where she passed away, or, maybe she's just hidden somewhere in the house. And so they really kind of ripped the house apart looking for her. But again, there was just nothing. And so after they finally stopped the search without finding Mary, the police contacted Mary's extended family and they asked them the same questions. Did Mary say anything about a trip she was going to take? Is there any reason she would just abandon her property? And they all would say, look, we don't talk to Mary. We don't know where she went. We have no idea. And so for a little while, the Houston police continued to search for Mary in and around Houston. But eventually, after finding nothing, the search kind of stopped, and they reached out to Mary's family and said, if you hear anything else about what happened to Mary, please let us know. Several months later, Mary's house went into foreclosure because no one was making the payments anymore, and the bank put her house up for auction. And a real estate entrepreneur in Houston bought the house up quickly, and after cleaning it out, he put it on the market to be rented out. And for the next couple of years, several tenants lived in Mary's old house, none of them staying for very long. Then in March of 2017, when the property was vacant, this young couple reached out to the landlord and said they were looking to rent, and they were hoping to potentially stay in this property for 2 or 3 years. The landlord was thrilled, and he sent over a lease for them to sign. And then once the couple had signed the lease and the property was theirs, the husband decided to just go over on his own and walk around the property and see what they would need to buy in terms of furnishings. And so the husband arrives at the property, he goes in the front door, he walks around the first floor, and then at some point he decides he wants to go up into the attic to see how much storage space they have. And so he gets underneath the trap door in the ceiling, he grabs the string and he pulls it down, revealing this folded up ladder. He flips down the lower ladder piece and puts it on the ground, and then he began climbing up. Once he got up into the attic, he stayed standing on the ladder and just kind of scanned around, and he saw there really wasn't much up there. There was a couple of metal cages that appeared to have been for pets or something, but it was very dirty and dark, and it appeared like no one had really come up here in a long time. And he kind of assumed that, the other tenants weren't using this as a storage space. And so the husband was about to go back down the ladder when he noticed off to the right side of the attic, kind of far away from the ladder, right where the roof begins to pitch down, he saw one of the floorboards was kind of popped up like it shouldn't be. And he stared at it, and he's looking around at the rest of the attic, and all of the floorboards were perfectly uniform, but that one was really jacked up. And so he was curious, and so he climbed up into the attic, and he kind of stooped down, and he walked over to this loose floorboard, and when he was standing over it, he could tell that this floorboard had kind of popped off of this hole in the ground, that the floorboard had been covering this hole. But the hole was dark, and so he pulled out his phone and he turned on his flashlight and he looked straight down and he aimed the light into this hole. Now, this hole was basically just a gap between two of the walls on the first floor. And so he's shining his light down into this gap, and he sees at the bottom the remains of the woman the Houston police have been looking for the past 2 years. Mary Cerruti. While no one knows for sure exactly what happened to her, it's believed back in early 2015 when she went missing, she had gone up into the attic where perhaps her cats liked to sunbathe off to the side of the attic because there was a big window that looked into the attic. And so she went up there to maybe feed the cats or check on the cats that were up there. And when she walked over to that side of the attic where the window looked in, she stepped on that loose floorboard and it gave out from her weight and she kind of fell through it like a trap door and fell down into that gap between the walls. It's unlikely she was hurt from this fall, but when she stood back up again in this kind of narrow space, she would have realized very quickly that there was nowhere for her to go. You can't go left, you can't go right, and you can't get back up into the attic. It was too far up for her to reach, and there was no way for her to kind of use the walls to climb back up because the space she was in was so narrow. I mean, she could barely move. She also didn't have a cell phone on her, so she couldn't call anyone. If she screamed out, no one would have heard her because she was behind several walls of insulation. And because no one ever checked on her, there was no one that was just going to find her trapped in the wall. She was totally on her own. And so trapped in this little space, Mary spent probably a couple of days screaming and trying to get her way out, but nothing worked. And then eventually she passed away. And then unfortunately, all of her cats did too. Her death was ruled an accident. In the spring of 2017, Antonio Navarrete was on top of the world. Just a year earlier, the 21-year-old Florida resident had met the love of his life, a young woman named Daisy Martinez. And now Daisy was pregnant, and so she and Antonio were very excited about starting a family together. For the time being, Antonio and Daisy were living with Antonio's parents in his hometown of Waimama, which is a quiet rural suburb just south of Tampa. But Antonio had a bright future ahead of him. Ever since he had graduated high school, he knew what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be an auto mechanic, and he had the skills to do it. From the time he was a toddler, he had always been obsessed with cars, breaking apart his toy cars and putting them back together. And then as he got a little bit older, he began drawing these very intricate drawings of cars that he loved or designs for new cars. And then when he was a teenager, he began actually tinkering around with real cars until he finally acquired a car of his own. It was a white Chevy lowrider pickup truck that he tricked out with all these fancy lights and special rims and this huge sound system that took up most of his back seat. It was thanks in part to this truck, which he nicknamed Casper, that Antonio, who was too shy to be much of a ladies' man, met up with Daisy in the first place. Antonio had driven Casper to a local car meetup for other car enthusiasts, where you could basically park your vehicle and you could walk around and see what other people did to upgrade or enhance their vehicles. And so while Antonio was there, he was walking around when he saw on the far side of this meetup, there was this unbelievably beautiful young woman, and he found himself just staring at her. He couldn't help it. And this young woman, who was Daisy, she eventually would look up and she would smile at him, and the rest, as they say, was history. 6 months later, not long after Daisy had moved in with Antonio at his parents' house, and the couple had announced to their delighted families that they were going to have a baby, Antonio got yet another good piece of news. He'd landed a good job with a company that did maintenance work for Tampa Electric Company's Big Bend power plant, which was located in Apollo, Florida, which was about 10 miles to the east of Antonio's parents' home. Now, this was not Antonio's dream job. He still very much wanted to eventually become an auto mechanic, but this job paid $12 an hour, nearly double what he was used to making. And so with this job, he and Daisy would finally be able to raise enough money to get a place of their own, hopefully before the baby arrived that fall. Also, Antonio had been told by other people who worked at this company that this was actually a really easy job, that pretty much you just rolled around on golf carts all day picking up trash. It was perfect. A few weeks later, on June 24th, Antonio found himself driving in his truck to the Big Bend power plant for his first day on the job. As he drove, he would have glanced over at the picture of Daisy he had taped to his dashboard dashboard. She was the only woman he had ever loved besides his mother. When Antonio arrived at the Big Bend power plant, he was totally amazed at just how enormous this thing was. It was basically this huge factory that sat right up against the water, and there were 4 huge smokestacks coming out of the ceiling of this factory with white smoke billowing out of them. This plant produced electricity, and they did this by burning coal. This process was done in 4 distinct units that were inside of this factory that Antonio was looking at. And each of these units is comprised of a humongous boiler, which is basically a 12-story tall oven. And so coal is loaded into this huge boiler, and it burns at the bottom of the boiler, creating some steam. And that steam goes up the boiler and begins to turn these huge turbines, creating the electricity. And then the steam just continues up the boiler and then out its respective smokestack into the air. In newer units, the airborne ash, which is a natural byproduct of burning coal, is captured inside of the boiler. But at Big Bend, 3 of their 4 units were built in the 1970s, so they were older models, and they did not capture the airborne ash inside the boilers. Instead, the ash would get heated up so much that it would melt and turn into a substance called slag, which basically is molten lava, like the stuff that comes out of volcanoes. That's what slag is. And so as this slag kind of builds up inside of the boiler, it would go through this man-sized hole at the very bottom of the boiler, and right below that hole is this 30-foot tall water tank called a cooling tank, and this red-hot slag, it basically dumps down into that water, which cools it off, turning it into these kind of glassy rocks. And then they settle at the bottom of this 30-foot cooling tank, and at the bottom of the cooling tank is this grinding mechanism that pulls these hardened, cooled off little boulders of slag into it, and it crushes them up and spits them out on the other side as little tiny bits of slag chips. And then these chips get sold for use in everything from sandpaper to roofing shingles. So after Antonio had spent several minutes just admiring this gargantuan building he would be working in, he gathered up his things, he hopped out of his truck, and he headed toward the front doors. That day, and the next couple of days, were very uneventful for Antonio. He basically just sat in a break room and watched videos about safety and training, and then when he wasn't doing that, he was out trying to navigate around the inside of this huge factory, which was basically this huge maze. And he found very quickly that it was a very hazardous place to work, as there were huge trucks moving around inside of it, it was super loud, and there was just heavy machinery operating constantly all around you. But after several days of just kind of walking around and asking people what things were, Antonio felt like he had a pretty good handle on the layout and also on what his job would entail. On Thursday, June 29th, so just 4 days into doing this new job, Antonio woke up in his parents' house in a really good mood because the next day, that Friday, Daisy was going in for an ultrasound and they were going to find out whether their baby was a boy or a girl, and he was very excited about this. And so Antonio came downstairs, he grabbed a quick bite to eat, and then he kissed Daisy on the cheek, and he headed outside into his truck and began the commute to work. A few hours later, Antonio's mother was in the grocery store when she pulled her phone out of her purse, and she noticed Antonio had called her and she missed it, but he had left a voicemail. And so she played the voicemail and then put the phone to her ear. And what she heard was quite possibly the most traumatic thing a mother could ever hear from their child. After leaving the house that morning, Antonio drove all the way to work, no problem. He parked in the lot, he went inside the building, and initially the day was like any other day. He just kind of drove around the facility and picked up trash, and that was it. But just a couple of hours into his shift, 2 fairly significant issues arose simultaneously inside of Unit 2. In the boiler, the slag that was building up had somehow created a sort of plug over that man-sized hole where the slag was supposed to dump into the water chamber. And so as more and more slag was being created as the ash melted, it wasn't draining into that chamber, and so all of this slag was just building up on top of itself inside of the boiler. And then in the water chamber, completely unconnected from the issue in the boiler, the slag that had fallen into the water chamber, that had cooled and settled at the bottom, it had landed in such a way that it actually blocked the grinding mechanism. And so none of the cooled slag boulders and rocks were being ground up and expelled out the other side. And so they needed to fix these 2 issues quickly, otherwise Unit 2 would become basically ineffective. Now, the safe way to fix these 2 blockages would be to start by turning off Unit 2's boiler. And then once it was off, you could drop dynamite into the boiler itself and break up the blockage over the man-sized hole, and you could send a team into the water chamber after you drained it to chip away and move the blockage over the grinding mechanism. However, turning a boiler off at a power plant is extremely expensive. And so the Tampa Electric Company decided, you know what, let's just have them fix these blockages without turning the boiler off. And so at 4 in the afternoon, a senior plant manager rounded up 5 other employees, which included Antonio, to come with him and do these repairs inside of Unit 2. And so the plan was to empty all the water from the cooling chamber of Unit 2, and then once it was empty, they would open something called the doghouse door, which is on the outside of the cooling chamber towards the bottom. They would open that up, giving them a line of sight into the bottom of this cooling chamber where that grinding mechanism was, where all those slag rocks had kind of come to a stop on top of it, and they would fire water cannons into the bottom of this cooling chamber to attempt to dislodge these slag rocks off of the grinding mechanism. And then after they cleared that blockage, they would shut the doghouse door and they would somehow deal with the blockage inside of the boiler. But that felt like a secondary issue. They needed to make sure the grinding mechanism was cleared before they did anything else. Now, you need to understand that this company had asked their employees to do this type of repair before, to do it with the boiler still on, and in the past, nothing bad had ever happened. And so these 6 guys, including Antonio, must have thought this was just totally routine, that we would never be asked to do something like this if it was extremely hazardous. But it would turn out what they were doing, making these repairs with the boiler still on, was quite possibly the most hazardous thing they could possibly do at this plant. But either way, the 6-man team made their way over to Unit 2, and they began taking up positions with their water cannons right in front of the doghouse door. Antonio's job for this operation was actually not to be involved in getting the slag free. He was just going to be there to clean up during and after the operation. And so he stood kind of in front of the doghouse door, but maybe 10 or 15 feet back, just kind of standing back, watching the other guys do their jobs. Now, you need to understand the scale of the machinery in front of Antonio and these other men. You have the water chamber, which is 30 feet tall, and then above the water chamber is the 12-story tall boiler that is still on. So there's coal actively burning inside of it. There's red hot slag, so like lava, just kind of tumbling around inside of it. And the steam inside of this boiler is well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And so they are dwarfed by this totally dangerous piece of machinery. But eventually, their operation begins. The senior plant manager has the water chamber drained, and then after it's empty, they open the doghouse door, and Antonio watched as the other 5 men took turns with their water cannons, firing them through this door at the big slag rocks that are sitting on top of the grinding mechanism. And it wasn't really working that well, but they were starting to make some progress, and Antonio likely was just kind of getting bored, waiting for this to be over, because there really wasn't much for him to do. There wasn't much cleanup. And then as he's standing there, something horrible happened. Because the boiler had been left on, all that ash was still getting melted and turned into slag. And the slag was not being drained because that plug had formed over the man-sized hole in the boiler. And so you have all this slag that's building up. It's getting heavier and heavier and heavier. And about 20 minutes into their cleanup operation, the weight of all that slag broke through that plug, immediately creating an opening where all this red hot slag, this lava, came tumbling down. It rebounded on the back end of the empty water tank and shot out of the doghouse door like a tidal wave of hellfire. And in seconds, thousands of gallons of this lava-like substance was all over all 6 men. It was like a wave going over them. And then after the slag hits the ground, they were all standing in 6 inches of basically lava that stretched in 40 feet in any direction. Now, unlike trying to run in, let's say, mud or deep water where you're just kind of moving slowly, every step you take in this slag, basically your foot melts into the slag. So with every step, your shoe melts, then your skin melts, then your bones melt into this substance. And so all these men, after immediately being hit with this stuff and catching on fire, literally, they likely tried to start running, but it was like their bodies were slowly consumed by this slag feet first. And so Antonio tried to run like the rest of them, but he couldn't go anywhere and he fell onto the slag. So he's laying on his side, and as he's melting and burning to death, he reaches into his pants pocket with his free hand and he pulls his phone out and he calls his mother. She doesn't pick up, and so he leaves her a voicemail, and all he says is, "Mom, I'm burning. Please call the cops. Please, Mom." And in the background of this voicemail, all you hear is the hissing sound of the steam and slag pouring out of the boiler. In total, 5 of the 6 men that were a part of this repair operation would be killed from this tidal wave of slag. Antonio would be one of them. Tampa Electric would end up paying out a settlement to each of the families of the deceased. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please log on to the Like Button's Netflix account and fast forward all of their continue watching shows approximately 2 or 3 minutes. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast that puts out brand new, never before heard stories every Monday morning. We also put out a remastered version of the audio from a popular YouTube video on Thursday mornings. And so that podcast is just called the MrBallen's Podcast. You can find it on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google, anywhere you get your podcasts, you can find it there. If you want to get in touch with me, you can send me a direct message on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is just MrBallen, and I do check the majority of my DMs. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts, and we post short random videos and lost episodes. And the other channel is a Spanish language channel, and it's just called MrBallen en Español. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen that puts out near daily content. We also have a Snapchat channel just called MrBallen that puts out content on Sundays. We also have some really cool merchandise, so if you want to have a look at that, go to shopmrballen.com. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, podcasts, additional YouTube channels, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, we have a very special bonus video for you guys. It's a collection of 5 fan favorite stories that show adventure often comes with a price. Now, these 5 fan favorites have all been completely re-edited, so even if you have previously maybe seen or heard them before, I promise you, this is going to be like a whole new viewing experience. But before we get into today's 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and pull out their very best button-up shirt and go ahead and remove all the buttons. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. In 2017, 27-year-old Lydia Makarchuk left her home country of Ukraine and moved to Bracknell, which is a town just outside of London. Shortly after moving into her new apartment, Lydia went out and got a job as an accountant at a local hotel, and then after that, Lydia pretty much swore off her social life and instead just focused exclusively on working hard and saving money. The one reprieve she got from work was going to church on Sundays. 2 years later, Lydia was at her church enjoying the coffee hour that always followed the Sunday sermon when another member of her church, who she didn't really speak to, this 41-year-old man named Norbert Varga, approached her and kind of awkwardly complimented her shoes. And she was so flattered by this that it opened up a friendly conversation between the two of them. And during this conversation, Lydia was pleasantly surprised to find out that Norbert was an expat too. An expat is someone who lives outside of their native country. Norbert had moved to the UK in 2018, so that's 1 year after Lydia had moved to the UK, and he came from Hungary, which shares a border with Ukraine. And just like Lydia, when he got to the UK, he kind of put all his energy into his work and trying to save money. He was a radio technician and a photographer. And so the two spend the rest of this coffee hour chatting and enjoying each other's company. And then afterwards, when they left the church and they both got home, they both found themselves thinking about the other. There was clearly an attraction there. And so the following Sunday, they both very eagerly rushed back to church in order to spend more time together. And sure enough, during that coffee hour, they spent the whole time together just chatting it up. And then afterwards, they exchanged phone numbers and made plans to get together outside of church. They were going to go on a date. And so the rest, as they say, is history. 2 years after Norbert complimented Lydia's shoes, they got married in Bracknell. And while the wedding was great, unfortunately, none of Lydia's family members, who were all in Ukraine, none of them could attend the actual wedding. And so the newlywed couple decided the way they would handle that is their honeymoon would be spent in Ukraine. That way Lydia's family could celebrate their wedding as well. For a variety of reasons, this honeymoon trip to Ukraine kept getting pushed back, but finally in September of 2021, everything lined up, everyone was available, and so Norbert and Lydia rushed to the airport and they hopped on a flight. And during this flight to Ukraine, Lydia remembers being so excited specifically about her husband finally getting a chance to spend some time with her 29-year-old younger brother Miroslav. Lydia was very close with her brother, and so it mattered to her greatly that he and her husband had a good relationship. But to that point, because of the great physical distance between the UK and Ukraine, the two had really not had that much interaction, and so they really didn't know each other very well. And so this trip was really important to Lydia, and Miroslav, he really picked up on that because he put together this camping trip for the end of their stay in Ukraine, where he knew he'd be able to step aside with Norbert and chat with him and get to know him a little bit. And so that was kind of like the fail-safe, where if he and Norbert did not get a chance to speak all week because they were visiting with so many people, they would have a chance to at the end of the week on this camping trip. So after a few hours of flying, Lydia and Norbert touch down in Ukraine, and they make their way to Lydia's family's house where they're going to be staying for the week. And that night, and for the next several days, the couple was swamped with several family reunions and meetups with old friends that hadn't seen Lydia in years. And so Norbert and Miroslav were not getting any time to themselves, and Lydia really knew that. And so she and Norbert began looking forward to this camping trip because that not only represented a kind of peaceful break from the chaos of all these reunions, but it also did represent the one chance they knew Miroslav and Norbert would get to interact with each other. And so finally, September 15th, the end of the week, it came, and it was time to go on this camping trip. And so Lydia and Norbert and Miroslav and 9 other family members, they all packed up their tents and their camping belongings, and they loaded up a couple of cars, and they drove over to the base of the Carpathian mountain range. This mountain range, which stretches for nearly 1,000 miles across Eastern and Central Europe, are very popular amongst tourists because it's stunningly beautiful. Everything is green and lush, and there are these crystal clear lakes and breathtaking waterfalls and all these amazing animals running around, and there's no mosquitoes, and they have these really cool hikes that bring you up to these very impressive overlooks. And so that night, Miroslav had made reservations for this one campsite, this very popular campsite that was up in this clearing, not too far up the mountain, and it had this great view down to the forest below, and because it was in a clearing, it had this unobstructed view up to the sky, where in this area, you could look up and just see stars in every direction. And so when Lydia and the rest of this group arrive in the parking lot of this mountain range, they were all really excited to get up to this campsite and just enjoy being there. And so they park their cars, they get their gear out, they find the trailhead, and then they begin hiking up the mountain. And about 2 hours later, they arrive at this clearing. They find their campsite, which was marked by this small fire pit underneath a couple of trees. And so they go over and they set their tents up, and some people go out and get some firewood. And then before long, a fire was made, and this group of 12 people that had not seen each other in so long, they just sat down and began enjoying each other's company. They put tea on, they were swapping stories. It was really just this wonderful time. And then around 8 p.m., the sun started to set, at which point this huge group just stopped and enjoyed this beautiful sunset. And then once the sun had gone down, there were 2 kids that were there on this trip. And so they were put to bed in their tent. And then the remaining 10 adults just kind of hung out by the fire and enjoyed each other's company. And it was actually during this second half of the night that Norbert and Miroslav finally really got a chance to just chat with each other. So for about an hour, they were talking to each other, and Lydia is just watching this happen, and she couldn't be happier. This is like the perfect ending to this trip. And then around 9 p.m., Norbert stands up. Lydia sees him stand up, and he tells the group he's going to run back back to his tent, which was a ways away from the campfire, and he was going to get his camera. And so Lydia said, okay, no problem. And she remembers watching him walk off into the distance, because when you're at the campfire, if you're looking away from the campfire, everything is pitch black in that direction. And so she watches him disappear into the darkness, and then she and her brother and everyone else just kind of turn back towards the campfire. And then all she remembers about what happens next is she heard a whistling sound. And at first it was very faint, but it started to get very, very loud. And when it got loud, she tried to kind of figure out where it was. But before she could, suddenly something hit her in the face, predominantly hit her in the nose. And as soon as it did, she went blind, she went deaf, and then she felt herself on the ground, and she has no idea what's going on. And all she can remember thinking is, oh my God, something horrible has happened to me. I might die. I don't know what's happening, but I might die. And so she started praying for herself to survive whatever was happening to her. And then her hearing started to come back just a little bit. Her vision was still totally blurred. She could only kind of tell where the fire was because it was bright, but her hearing, it started to come back. And that's when she heard moaning coming from somewhere near her. And so she's thinking, okay, whatever horrible thing has happened to me has happened to other people too. And so instead of just praying for herself, she began praying for everyone who was at this campsite. And so as her hearing is getting louder and louder, and she's hearing more and more moaning and crying happening all around her, she suddenly hears her husband screaming her name. Her vision is still gone, but she knows it's him, and he lands right behind her and he grabs her and he's just repeating her name over and over and over again. And then Lydia manages to kind of choke out to her husband, what happened? And there's a pause, and then Norbert says to her, it's bad. It's really bad. It would turn out their campsite was on a battlefield from World War I. And buried underneath the soil, right under their fire pit, was an unexploded bomb from World War I. Meaning, for over 100 years, countless campers have arrived at this campsite and lit fires on top of this bomb that they couldn't see. And each fire gradually eroded the outer metal casing of this explosive, until finally that night in September, with Lydia and 11 of her loved ones nearby, their little fire finally was it. It pushed through that last little bit of the casing, and it ignited the bomb, and it detonated. That whistling that she heard was the sound of the fire finally cutting through that casing and being exposed to the fire. And then that thing that struck her in the face, that hit her right on the nose, that was almost certainly a piece of the bomb itself, so shrapnel that was cutting through her face. And then the moaning she heard was primarily her brother, who was right next to her. Lydia would be gravely wounded, but she would survive. As for her brother and another man who was not named, they would not survive. Here is a picture that was taken of the group literally minutes before this bomb detonated. At 11:40 a.m. on December 21st, 2003, three young men who were longtime childhood friends hopped in a truck and began traveling south. They were 22-year-old Brett Mann and 19-year-olds Sean Blowers and Ashley McGuff. They lived in a coastal city called Darwin, which is actually the capital of the Northern Territory in Australia. The Northern Territory, also known as the Top End, is located in the central north of the continent. It is 6 times larger than the UK, but has 280 times less people living in it. Specifically, the UK is home to roughly 70 million people, whereas the Top End is home to only 250,000 people, and half of them live in Darwin. There are many reasons why the Top End is so underpopulated, ranging from politics to poor infrastructure, but the most obvious reason that so few people choose to live in this part of Australia is because it is wildly rugged and dangerous. It is scorchingly hot year-round, and the weather in general is just unbelievably unpredictable and violent. And as the old saying goes, all the animals there are trying to kill you and each other. But Brett, Sean, and Ashley had grown up in Darwin, and so they were accustomed to the hazards of living in the Top End, and so they weren't really concerned about them. What they were concerned with was finding things to do and not getting bored in the city. That particular day, in order to ward off boredom, the trio had decided they would head out to a salt flat that was located about 50 miles to the southwest of Darwin. It was this wide open plain plane that they could just race around on their quad bikes on. And so they loaded these quad bikes into their trailer, attached it to their truck, they hopped in their truck, and at 11:40 a.m., they started heading south out of Darwin. The first road they were on was this fairly desolate dirt road that wound around through the wilderness, and it passed by the iconic eucalyptus trees that are very well known in Australia. It passed by palm trees and giant termite mounds. And after driving on this dirt road for about 30 minutes, the trio passed by the Tumbling Waters Holiday Park, which is a vacation resort for adventurous families. And then beyond this park, there really was no more civilization. They were headed right into the outback of Australia. And so this was kind of like the last mark of civilization. And so the trio, they drive for another 30 minutes past the park. And at some point, all of the trees on either side of the road start getting more and more dense until they begin kind of encroaching over the road, as if it looks like you're driving directly through the heart of a jungle. And they would have recognized this change in scenery as meaning they were nearing the Finnis River, which was off to their right beyond all of the trees. So they couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And the Finnis River was not a huge waterway. It was a 30-mile stretch that ran east to west through the top end. And what it was known for was being very brackish and dark. You could not see into this water more than maybe an inch or two. So it almost appeared black. And so the trio continued driving along through this kind of jungle atmosphere until the left side of the road began to thin out again. And then it eventually revealed the salt flats up to their left. And so at that point, the trio pulled off on the right side of the road where the vegetation was still very thick. And then the trio hopped out of the truck, they went around to their trailer, they dropped the gate, and one by one they pulled their quad bikes off, and then each of them hopped on and drove out onto the flats. That day, the flats were actually very muddy because it had recently rained really heavy in that area. And so the trio spent just as much time racing each other on the flats as they did trying to drive close to each other and spray mud on each other. And so for hours, they were out there having a great time. And then at 4:30 p.m., they decided it was time to call it a day. And so they drove back over to the truck. They drove their quad bikes up onto the trailer. They locked it. And then they were about to get into the truck to head back home when one of them suggested, hey, let's head down to the water and rinse our clothes off and get all this mud off of us. Now, you need to understand, in the top end, the place you want to spend the least amount of time in is the water. People in the top end assume that in any natural water body that is not clearly designated as a swimming area has at least one animal lurking in it that will kill you. This is a literal precaution people in the top end take. And so this section of the Finnis River that these three friends were thinking about going and jumping into and washing off inside of, this was not a clearly designated swimming area, and so it should be avoided. But you need to remember, these three guys, they grew up in the top end. They were used to living in this kind of wild area, and they'd also come to the salt flats so many times over the years, and they had jumped into the Finnis River before to wash off and go swimming, and nothing had ever happened. And so really, the idea that the Finnis River could be dangerous to them, it didn't really cross their mind. They felt like, you know what, we've been there, done that. Nothing's going to happen to us. And so they left the truck and walked away from the salt flats into this mangrove forest that's only a couple of feet off the road and began walking towards this river. Normally, the trip from the road through the forest to the river bank, basically where the forest ended and you reach the river, it would take about 10 minutes. But after walking in this mangrove for maybe a minute, they were already standing in river water. It was only a couple of inches of this water, but it signaled to the guys that clearly the river is very swollen from all of the recent rains, enough so that it overflowed beyond its natural boundaries and it's flooded the mangrove forest. But the three guys, they look at each other and think, meh, what's the big deal? I'm sure we'll be fine. And so the guys continued moving on, but as the mangroves began to thin out, they began to slow down dramatically because the riverbanks on the edges of the Finnis River were very steep. If you were standing on dry land, if there was no flooding, and you were right on the edge of the Finnis River, if you took even 1 or 2 steps into the river, you would slip down under the water and the water would be over your head. Now, as these guys are walking, walking, because the ground is flooded with this black, brackish water, they couldn't see the ground, and so they couldn't tell where the drop-off into the river was. And so they began to slow down, and then when all the trees were practically gone, they knew they were close, and then one of them actually slipped and kind of tumbled down the edge for a second, but he turned and he grabbed one of the roots of the mangrove tree and pulled himself back up. And then the other two, after seeing this, they walked over and stood next to him, and the trio just stood there looking out at this pitch black looking river that was very clearly moving faster than normal because of all this excess rain. But they kind of looked at each other and thought, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. We'll hold on to the roots of these mangroves and lower ourselves over the embankment. We'll wash ourselves off, pull ourselves back up. No big deal. And so they each turned around and grabbed a root of one of the many mangrove trees that marked the edge of this forest. And while holding on, they would lower their lower half down past the embankment until they were submerged. They rubbed all the mud off of themselves, being very careful not to let go of the mangrove at any point. And then as they were about to finish up and pull themselves back up and get back to their truck, Brett loses his balance and somehow lets go of the mangrove root and slips down the steep embankment. And suddenly the current takes him away from his friends and out to the middle of this river, and before long he's getting pulled downstream. And so he yells out to Ashley and Sean, who had their backs turned to him. They turn around, they see their friend, and they instinctively leap into the river to try to go get him and help swim him back to the side. Now all three of them were very competent swimmers, and so this was not a high panic situation. This was more like a inconvenience and maybe a little bit funny, and so that's why they leapt in no problem. They figured, worst case scenario is we'll drift somewhere down there and we'll get out and we'll walk our way back to our car. But as soon as Sean and Ashley were free floating in this river, they felt how strong this current was, and it was way stronger than they were anticipating. And so they actually started to get a little bit worried, and they looked up ahead of them, and Brett, who had been in the water for 10 or 15 seconds before they leapt in, he had already moved way farther downstream than them. And so they decided, what, we have to get out, but we need to get to Brett first. We all need to get out at the same place. And so they decide they're going to swim downstream, meet up with Brett, and then get the heck out of that river as fast as they possibly can. And so they yell out to Brett hey, we're coming to get you. And they start swimming as fast as they possibly can. And with the help of the current, they manage to get all the way up to Brett relatively quickly, maybe a couple of minutes. And when they reach him, Sean and Ashley go in front of Brett. And then the three of them, they stop actively swimming and they allow the current to just kind of carry them downstream. And as they're drifting, they begin scouting the left side of the river for a solid clump of mangrove trees they can swim into, because unless there's something to grab onto on the edge of this river, they can't pull themselves out. And so at this point, the trio is definitely uncomfortable being in the water because of how strong that current is, but they're confident they're going to find a viable landing spot and they're going to get out of here and it will be a great story. And so Sean is in the front, Ashley is right behind him, and then Brett is behind Ashley. And they're all about an arm's length away from each other. And they're drifting down this river for a couple of minutes. They're looking on the left side for a viable landing spot. And then all of a sudden, Ashley just yells out, hey, I see something in the water. We need to get out. Find the nearest tree. Get out, get out, get out. And so Sean, he starts panicking. He doesn't even turn around to see what's going on behind him. Adrenaline kicks in and he swims as fast as he possibly can to a tree that's popped out of the river. It's literally growing in the middle of the river. And so he swims up to this tree. He manages to climb up to the first fork of the tree, which is maybe 6 or 8 feet above the water. And as soon as he's up there, he turns around and looks down and he sees Ashley. He reaches down and he hoists Ashley up to the first fork with him. And then the pair turn around again to grab Brett, but Brett's not there. And so they look around, they're thinking, okay, did Brett not make it to the tree? Did the current pull him around? Is he at some other tree? They're yelling out for him, they're looking for him, but there's no Brett. And so they're talking to each other, Ashley and Sean. They're saying, hey, did he call out? Did you hear something? Did he give some indication about where he was going? And they're saying, no, I don't know where he is. And so they start climbing up the tree a little bit and trying to look down and up the river to see if maybe they can see him. And then all of a sudden, Sean notices something yellow flash beneath them in the water. And so he looks straight down and he sees this yellow thing down there. And so he nudges Ashley and he says, look. And so Ashley looks down, and as they're looking, they're about 10 feet off the water at this point. They see this yellow thing start rising up to the surface. Now, the water is so dark, they really can't tell what anything is unless it is at the surface. And so they're watching this yellow thing, and suddenly it comes out of the water, and they see It's Brett. He's got his yellow jacket on. That's what they saw. And Brett is in the mouth of a 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. He is face down and his left side is being held in this animal's mouth and he's not moving. And so Sean and Ashley are so scared, they're just frozen. They're just staring at this monster that's in the water, that's holding their friend underwater, and they can't do anything about it. And for 2 minutes, they just stand there looking at this animal, wondering what's going to happen. And for those entire 2 minutes, the crocodile stared right back up at Ashley and Sean as if it was showing them what it was going to do to them once they got in the water. That I've done this to your friend, I'm getting you to as well. And so they're staring at this animal when suddenly it just kind of goes underneath the water back down into the black abyss, and it, along with Brett, just disappear. Ashley and Sean are so terrified that they can't even grieve for their friend. They can't feel sad for him. It's like they just go into survival mode. And without saying anything to each other, they just start climbing up this tree as fast and as far as they possibly can. And they only manage to get up maybe a couple more feet to 2 more branches. One's at about 10 or 12 feet off the water, and the other is at about 15 feet off the water. And so Sean makes it onto the lower branch, and then Ashley makes it onto the slightly higher branch. And then once they're situated on their branch and one arm is firmly wrapped around the trunk of the tree, they're able to kind of breathe for a second and take stock of their situation. And even though, of course, the elephant in the room here is that their friend was just eaten by a crocodile, but it's like they can't process that yet. Instead, they start talking about, okay, well, our families, they're going to recognize our absence and they're going to tell the police, and the police are going to launch a search and they're going to come find us. Both of them were confident, or they acted confident, that that was going to happen, but they also knew that there was no timeline for this. It could be hours or days until this actually happened. And so as these two teens are sitting on their branches, the reality of their situation really started to come crashing down on them, because yeah, they're safe in this tree, but how long can they possibly stay in this tree for? I mean, eventually they're going to need to fall asleep. And if they fall asleep, are they going to fall out of the tree and land in the water with this crocodile? I mean, they just didn't know how this was going to turn out. And so as the two began comforting each other, reassuring each other that, oh no, it's going to be just fine. Someone's going to find us tonight or tomorrow. We'll be just fine. As they're doing that, Ashley suddenly stops talking to Sean and just looks straight down. And so Sean realizes what Ashley's doing, and he matches his gaze. And he looks straight down, and at the base of their tree, in that black water, is the 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. It's back, and it no longer has Brett in its mouth. They have no idea where Brett is. He's just gone. Saltwater crocodiles are considered the most aggressive and dangerous crocodiles in the world. And they are one of only 2 crocodile species that will actively hunt humans when given a chance. And so these 2 teens are helpless in this tree. All they have is some separation from the black water and this animal down below. And so they just find themselves staring straight down at this crocodile. And in turn, this crocodile just stares right back up at them. It's very clearly waiting for them. It wants them to come out of the tree so it can eat them. And so the crocodile just continuously repositions itself all around the tree. It's just keeping the top of its head out of the water so its eyes can look up at them. And so the teens are just praying that at some point it will grow tired of them and will leave. And after several hours, right as the sun is about to set, this crocodile does seem to give up on them, and it drifts under the water and disappears. After a couple of minutes, Sean, who was on the slightly lower branch, decides he doesn't want to be any closer to the water than he needs to be, and he's going to climb up to Ashley's branch. And so he very carefully stands up on his branch. He makes sure he's got solid footing, and then he reaches up and he grabs a branch with his right hand, and he kind of tests it, and he feels like it's pretty sturdy, and then he puts all his weight on it and tries to reach for another branch when this one breaks. And as soon as that branch broke, Sean tumbled 10 feet into the water. And so he hits the water, he goes all the way under, he sinks a few feet under, and immediately he's turned around and he's trying to swim as fast as he can to the surface, and he's just expecting at any moment this crocodile is going to bite him. He gets to the surface and he looks around. It's a little bit dark, but he can immediately see his tree, and he realizes the current has pulled him away from his tree. And so in a panic, he starts swimming and kicking his legs as hard as he possibly can to get back to this tree. And he knows the whole time he's kicking his legs, he's just attracting the attention of this crocodile, but he's got nothing else he can do. He's got no other tree he can reasonably get to that will provide safety from this animal. And so with every ounce of energy he's got, he kicks and swims, and finally he manages to grab a root of this tree that his friend is still inside of, and he begins pulling himself with his lower half still submerged in the water. And so as he's dragging himself towards the trunk of this tree, he's just waiting for this crocodile to bite down on his legs, and finally he gets to the trunk of the tree and he's able to pull his body out of the water, and he clambers up to that original branch he was on, and then he and Ashley work to get him up to Ashley's branch. And as soon as he sits down next to Ashley and he's secure, they both look down, and just a little ways away from the tree, basically in the area where Sean had just landed in the water, they see with the little light that is left, this crocodile swimming right back over to the tree, and it camps out right underneath. Sean had gotten out just in time. When the sun finally did set about 10 or 15 minutes later, it became pitch black. There's no ambient light in this part of the world. There aren't any buildings or cities close enough to this area, and so it is truly pitch black. And so they could no longer see the crocodile down below. But they knew it was there because periodically they would hear it repositioning itself right underneath them. Also, because it was so dark, the two teens could not actually see each other. And so they began holding on to each other, and then anytime either of them moved, they would announce their movement to the other, just so they knew they had not fallen asleep and were not falling out of the tree to a horrible death. And so a few hours went by like this, where it was silence with the exception of the sounds of this crocodile repositioning itself periodically. A little after midnight, a huge storm rolled into this area, and it began absolutely downpouring, and the raindrops that were hitting the river were so loud that the teens could no longer hear the sound of this crocodile, and so they had no idea if it was still down below them or not. But every time lightning would strike, it would illuminate the sky for that flash of a second, and in that flash they would look down, and there would be the crocodile. After several hours of this super intense downpour, the two teens also started to become concerned that all this additional rain could raise the water level of the river all the way up high enough that this crocodile might be able to jump out and reach their legs. But because it was so dark, they couldn't actually see the top of the water, and so they had no way of knowing if the water levels were actually rising or not. And so they both kind of sucked their legs up onto this branch and tried to make themselves as small as they could while still remaining anchored to each other and also to the branch. And that's how they sat for the next several hours, just hoping they would survive the night. Finally, when the sun came up that following morning, the teens immediately noticed that the crocodile was still right below them, just lurking at the base of the tree, waiting for them. And they also noticed the water level of the river had clearly come up quite a bit. And so if they weren't rescued soon, there was a good chance that another heavy rainstorm, that crocodile would be in range of them, and there was nowhere they could go. They were as high up as they could get. Not to mention the fact they were hypothermic, they were weak, they were tired, and if you fall asleep, you're going to fall in the water. And so the two teens, they knew they did not have much time left. Luckily, at 10 a.m. that morning, they heard the sound of a police officer who was out in the mangrove forest. It turned out their families had recognized their absence. They had called the police, and that morning a search had been launched. They had found their truck and then had been walking down the river yelling out to them, and then they finally did find them. Initially, when they located these two teens stuck in the tree, they called in a helicopter to hover over them and lower down a ladder that could climb back up. But when the helicopter got close to this tree, the rotor wash from the spinning blades, it practically blew the boys out of the tree, and this crocodile was still in the water. The rescuers could see it, the boys could still see it, and so there was this fear that the helicopter would literally send them into the water to their death. And so they had to abandon the helicopter approach. However, the blades of that helicopter did ultimately scare this crocodile, and the crocodile swam away. And so as soon as the helicopter was off station, they had a boat come in, and the boat got right underneath the two boys. They jumped down into it, and they were brought to safety. The two boys were brought to a hospital where doctors determined they were physically okay, but both of them were severely traumatized from what they had just been through. As for Brett, despite an exhaustive search of that river, they never found his body or any of his clothing or any belongings he had on him, and they never found the crocodile that killed him. In 2019, a 32-year-old United States Army soldier was stationed in Hawaii for training. This was his first time ever being in Hawaii, and so on his first day off, he planned to do some sightseeing. After doing some research, he settled on the Hawaii Volcano National Park as the first place he would go check out. This is one of the top tourist attractions in Hawaii that sees over 2 million yearly visitors. One of the main draws of this particular park is that it's home to one of the world's most active volcanoes, the Kilauea, that has been erupting consistently almost every year since 1983. On the evening of Wednesday, May 1st, John finally was given some time off, and so he hopped in his rental car and he made his way out to the park. When he got there, he was pleasantly surprised to see that it was not crowded in the least, most likely because he was there midweek. And so he paid his entrance fee, and then he started walking up a trail that would bring him up to this overlook that overlooked the caldera. The caldera of a volcano is the actual crater, the inside of the volcano where the actual lava comes out of. At the time John was at the park, the volcano was not actively erupting, and so there was no pool of lava inside of the caldera. However, the surface of the caldera, which was 300 feet below this overlook where John is, the surface was still 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, causing these massive steam clouds to billow up from it pretty much constantly. And so when John actually reached this overlook point and was looking out into the caldera, he was immediately disappointed because he couldn't see anything. And so as much as John craned his neck to try to get a better look down into the caldera, he was just totally obscured by the steam. Now, he was up against a safety railing that prevented people from getting closer, but he figured if he could just get right to the edge of this crater and he could actually look down inside, he might be able to see all the way to the base of the caldera. And so he looked around and noticed there were no other tourists up there with him. So he thought about it for a second and then decided, yep, I'm gonna do this. And he stepped over the safety railing and walked right to the edge of this crater overlooking this caldera. And as soon as he got there, he suddenly had this unencumbered view of the space directly at the bottom of the edge of the cliff. He could actually see down into the caldera now. And so he got his phone out and he started taking some pictures, and then all of a sudden the ground underneath him began to shift, and it shifted so quickly and so suddenly that threw him onto his back. And as he's laying on his back, scrambling to get back up again, the ground underneath him just completely collapses, sending him careening down 300 feet into the scalding hot caldera. When John fell, another tourist did happen to walk up another nearby trail, and they actually saw him as he fell. And so they called 911, and immediately first responders were on scene, but they were facing the same issue that John was, which is the steam was so intense inside of this volcano that you can't really see down into it. And so they had rescuers walking along the rim of the volcano, and they had helicopters in the air, but it really wasn't doing any good. And in the back of all rescuers' minds, they knew that realistically, there's just no way John could have survived this. I mean, you can't survive a 300-foot fall, but even if you did, you couldn't survive being at the surface of the caldera that's over 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. You die within a couple of minutes. But the rescuers pushed that thought out of their mind, and they focused on being positive and just continuing to look for John. And 2 hours into their search, when it was totally dark outside and hope was just about gone at this point, somebody spotted John on a little ledge jutting out 70 feet down from that cliff he was standing on. When he fell, when the ground dissolved underneath him, he managed to land on this tiny little ledge. Had he fallen an inch left, an inch right, an inch forward, he would have tumbled to his death. There's no two ways about it. But he landed perfectly on the one ledge that could have saved his life. But he was so badly injured, he couldn't climb back up again. However, rescuers were able to rappel down to him, put him in a harness, get him back up, and he was able to make a full recovery. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they're just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around. He's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight. And it's hard for me to stand even. I'm going to sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before. And so it makes sense he might be tired. But they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on. They do have food. They do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before when they were up in the tree, even then it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here and we're going to eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son and he puts his son down by a tree and he sits down next to him and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is how? Because he couldn't walk until now. And my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree. He picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by presumably his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, and he's yelling out for his son. He's not hearing anything. And this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain, and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge. And he told the staff inside, my son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there. And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon that, the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. When most people picture Russia in their minds, they picture European Russia, which is literally the part of Russia on the western side that sits in Europe and is by far the most populated part of the country. But European Russia only accounts for 23% of the total territory that is Russia. The other 77% is to the east of European Russia. It starts at the Ural mountain range and it extends all the way over 5 million square miles to the Pacific Ocean. And this vast, mostly forested expanse, which is 50 times bigger than the entire United Kingdom, is called Siberia. And Siberia is absolutely brutal. In Siberia, it is almost always freezing cold. Literally, the average annual temperature across all of Siberia is 32.9 degrees Fahrenheit. So it is 0.9 degrees above freezing on average every single day. In addition to the extremely deadly weather that exists basically year-round in Siberia, Siberia is also home to a bunch of huge deadly animals, such as the brown bear, which is the same as the infamous grizzly bear in North America, the gray wolf, which by size alone makes virtually all other wolves look like little puppies. Gray wolves can grow to be nearly 200 pounds. And of course, there is the highly intelligent Siberian tiger, who is perhaps one of the only predators on Earth that is known to seek out and kill people for revenge. For example, in 1997, a hunter named Vladimir Markov was walking through a Siberian forest when he came face to face with one of these Siberian tigers, and he ended up shooting the tiger before fleeing, except the tiger didn't die. Instead, it got up and secretly followed Vladimir all the way back to his cabin, and then this tiger camped out outside of the cabin until Vladimir came out again, and the tiger pounced, killed him, and ate him. And so, unsurprisingly, Siberia has an absolutely minuscule population relative to its massive size. However, there are some adventurous people out there who are drawn to Siberia for the same reasons that most other people avoid it. These adventurous people see Siberia as one of the last truly wild places on our planet, and they want to experience it for themselves. And one of these highly adventurous people was a young man named Colin Madsen. Colin, who came from a very successful American family, was a big outdoors enthusiast who at some point in his youth began researching Siberia because he fell in love with its rugged natural beauty. He quickly began researching not only Siberia, but Siberian culture and Russian culture, and also at some point he became fluent in the Russian language. Then, in 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he left his home in Missouri and moved to Siberia. He settled in one of Siberia's few population centers, a city called Irkutsk, which is located in the southeast of Siberia and right along the edge of Lake Baikal, which is the world's deepest freshwater lake. Colin's Siberia plan was twofold. He would go to school while he was there, and he would go out and explore. And at first, his plan went perfectly. He was accepted into Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, and very quickly he made friends who were eager to accompany him on his adventures out into the Siberian wilderness. From his arrival in Siberia in 2013 to 2016, Colin did well in his studies, and he spent countless hours exploring the forests and mountainous areas all around Lake Baikal and right outside of Irkutsk. In fact, Colin became so familiar with this region that he began volunteering with a nonprofit in the area that went around marking new trails, which meant Colin was literally venturing into the wilds of Siberia and just marking the trail as he went. So when Colin's family heard about what happened to him in 2016, they could not believe it. In March of 2016, Colin and 3 of his good hiking friends, one was American and 2 were Russian, decided they wanted to go on a hike together. They settled on hiking to the summit of Love Peak, which was a mountain located a few hours away from Irkutsk in a small village called Arshan. This hike was nothing compared to the gnarly Siberian wilderness hikes all 4 of these guys had been on before. The trail that led up to Love Peak, it was fairly steep, but it was incredibly well marked, and all 4 of these guys had hiked it several times before. However, because Colin and his friends were so experienced at hiking in Siberia, they knew that even the easiest hikes needed to be respected, because Siberia was still Siberia. There were dangers that lurked everywhere. And so the men called ahead to the village of Arshan, and they rented one of these small rustic cabins that's in the village that sits right at the base of Love Peak, and it's kind of tucked away in this forest. And so this cabin would serve as their sort of base camp and would allow them to arrive in Arshan, get their gear together, and then when they were ready, they could begin this hike to the summit. And so a few days later, on March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends loaded up their car and they drove west to Arshan. And when they got there, they stopped at a local store and got some supplies and then made their way to their cabin. Their cabin was just a single room with a few beds inside of it. It was enough to protect them from the elements, but really nothing more. As for a toilet, the cabin didn't have one, but there was an outhouse outside that they could use. So after the friends moved into the cabin and claimed their beds and put their things down, they all sat down and began prepping their gear and eating some food and chatting. And then finally, at 2 a.m., they decided they needed to go to sleep because their plan was to get on the path up to Love Peak by 7 a.m., which meant they needed to get up at 5 a.m. to make their final preparations. So at 2 a.m., the lights in the cabin turned off and the friends all fell asleep. And then 3 hours later, at 5 a.m., when the lights came back on again, it was immediately clear something was wrong. Colin was not in his bed. His friends assumed, when they looked over at his bed and saw his personal belongings were all still there, that Colin must have gotten up and headed outside, maybe to use the outhouse or go for a quick walk, and they just hadn't heard him leaving. And so the 3 friends initially just kind of shrugged off Colin's absence and said, he'll be back any minute, most likely, and if for some reason he's not back soon, he'll certainly be back by 7 a.m., because that was the agreed upon time they would leave for this hike. But as the minutes ticked closer and closer to 7 a.m., and Colin still had not shown up or tried to call them or do anything, the friends started to worry. It just didn't make any sense that Colin would just get up and leave without telling them where he was going. Finally, at 7 a.m., when Colin still had not shown up, and the friends' cursory search of the outside area near the cabin had yielded no results, they decided they had to tell someone. And so they wrote a note addressed to Colin, and they put it on the front of their cabin door. And this note basically just told Colin, if you come back here and you see this note, know that we're looking for you. So stay put or tell someone you're here. And so after putting up this note, the friends left the cabin and they headed to the nearest police station where they reported Colin missing. The police would eventually launch this huge search in and around Arshan, both in the forested area right around the village and then also up into the mountains near Love Peak. But despite this huge effort, no one could find Colin, at least not at first. On Monday, April 4th, so 8 days into Colin's disappearance, a group of searchers were looking in the forest about 1 mile away from the cabin where Colin and his friends had been staying. And they look up ahead and they see there is this clearing and there's something in the middle of it. And so the searchers begin moving their way towards this clearing, ducking under branches and stepping over brush. And when they get close enough, they can see Colin is in the clearing and Colin is deceased. He was laying flat on his back with his left arm extended out to the side and his right arm extended but closer to his body, and both of his hands were clenched in tight fists. And on his hands and his wrists were visible abrasions and cuts, which later would be determined to have most likely been caused from someone or something holding on to him, trying to restrain Colin. Colin also had visible abrasions and cuts on the front of his neck. Colin's clothing, which consisted of a long-sleeve thermal shirt, heavy pants, and hiking boots, were ripped and torn in several places. And interestingly, Colin was not wearing socks under his boots. Now that seems inconsequential, but Colin had had surgery on both of his ankles and had scar tissue on his ankles that if he didn't have socks on, those scars would rub against the inside of his boot, and he said it was very painful. So he always wore socks. Also, Colin's body showed virtually no signs of decomposition, and all of his wounds and abrasions looked, quote, fresh, according to medical personnel. In short, Colin looked like he had recently been in some sort of physical altercation, and whoever or whatever he was grappling with had eventually overpowered him and killed him, although it was not clear how he actually died. Russian authorities were very quick to suspect Colin's 3 friends who had been with him, but they were brought into the station and they denied having anything to do with Colin's death, and they all passed their lie detector tests. After that, Russian authorities quickly closed this case by concluding that, well, if his friends didn't do it, then that means Colin must have been high on drugs or drinking alcohol or both, and he just wandered out of his cabin and he got lost in the woods and he died of hypothermia. He froze to death. The end. However, Colin's parents just could not accept that as being what happened to their son. There were a lot of reasons for skepticism, but the main one was that Colin was an absolute expert at navigating this particular region of Siberia. And so the idea that he would leave his cabin for a quick walk or something and get so completely lost that he would die 8 days later seemed way too far-fetched. And so Colin's parents hired a US-based private lab to do a review of Russia's autopsy of Colin to give their opinion if the autopsy was accurate or not. And this US-based lab pretty much immediately found that the Russian autopsy was not remotely accurate. Number 1, Colin was not under the influence of alcohol or drugs. He was sober. Although technically he did have very small amounts of THC in his urine. THC is the chemical that is found in marijuana, but the amount was so little, it basically meant he had consumed the THC days before he went missing. And so he would not have been remotely affected by that small amount of THC in his system. Number 2, the lab determined that Colin almost certainly did not die from hypothermia. Instead, all signs pointed to Colin dying from being suffocated, meaning he was murdered. Someone crushed his airway or in some way restricted him from breathing, and that's what killed him. And 3, based on the lack of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries on Colin's body, and the lack of animal predation on his body when they found him, indicated that Colin did not just wander out of his cabin and immediately die somewhere in the forest. Instead, he was alive for most of the time people were looking for him, meaning when they found him, he likely had died within hours of being found. And so these findings by this US-based lab kind of create a general theory about what must have happened to Colin. After Colin left the cabin in the early morning hours of March 28th, maybe to go to the outhouse or to go for a quick walk, when he went outside, someone or something was nearby, and they either lured Colin to them or they straight up ambushed Colin and took him away. Now, we have no idea what happened to Colin after he was abducted, but we can safely assume that after being abducted and taken somewhere, he was alive, and he stayed alive for several days until on the 8th day of his disappearance, Colin was killed, likely by his captor, either at the spot where he was found, or he was killed somewhere else, maybe in the forest, and then moved to the spot where he was found. Many people believe it was the Russian government who targeted Colin, they kidnapped him, and they killed him. And their botched investigation into his death was actually a calculated cover-up. Colin had participated in at least one peaceful environmentalist-led protest in Siberia, and after the protest, Colin apparently got a written warning by the Russian police not to attend another protest. But why would Colin, who was just one of many people involved in these protests, be singled out by the Russian government and killed for his participation? And why would the government elect to kill Colin when he was with 3 of his closest friends who would immediately notice his absence? It just doesn't add up. Today, Colin's parents are still trying to figure out what happened to their son, but unfortunately, their son's case is closed in Russia, and so no one on the Russian side is talking to the parents or giving them any new information. And so as a result, they and the rest of us are left to wonder who or what was lurking in the shadows when Colin stepped out of the cabin that morning. And then where did they take him? And what did they do to him for nearly a week before they killed him deep inside of that Siberian forest?
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
Today's story is a good old-fashioned scary story that you might tell around a campfire. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please superglue 50 harmonicas to the front of the like button's car right before they leave for work. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Sunday, February 25th, 1855, a 48-year-old woman named Hannah Rallinson, along with her husband and a group of her friends, walked quickly down a road in Sheffield, England. As they walked, the entire group was totally silent because they were terrified of what was going to happen next. Behind Hannah and her friends on this road was actually another slightly larger group of people that were keeping pace with Hannah and her friends. They were actually going to the same place as them, except this second group had no intention of going inside that building. They were just there to see what happened. Now, Hannah and her friends were totally offended and annoyed by this group that was following them, but they knew there was nothing they could do, and so they just kept on walking in silence. And as Hannah walked in silence, she couldn't help but think to herself, how in the world did I get into this position? At the time, Sheffield, England was a big industrial city with lots of metalworking factories all over the place. And so loads of people at the time were coming to Sheffield to work in those factories. And as the population increased in Sheffield, the city began building all these tenement apartments, which are kind of like these low quality, cramped, interconnected apartments that are basically cheap and easy to make and house lots and lots of people. Hannah and her husband lived in one of these tenement apartments, and they worked in one of the metalworking factories, which meant their lives were pretty rough and difficult. But recently, their lives had become even more challenging when their oldest son had died in a coal mining accident. And this totally devastated the parents, but Hannah definitely took it the worst. In her grief, Hannah became very antisocial and began just going to the factory and doing backbreaking labor all day, and then came straight home. She would go to a room by herself, and she would just sit there all night and pray and try to communicate with her dead son. Now, at first, Hannah's husband basically did the same thing as Hannah. He put all of his energy and his time and his focus on work, even though it was totally backbreaking and miserable, mainly because it was a distraction from this terrible grief he was dealing with. But after several weeks and months went by, Hannah's husband did begin to kind of get back to normal and began to move forward with his life. But he could see Hannah was not doing that. Hannah was totally depressed and isolated, and so he eventually encouraged her to start going back to church and start spending more time with people there, make some new friends, and hopefully being around some people will help you cope with this tragedy. And Hannah had actually taken her husband's advice. She began going back to church, she made a bunch of new friends, she rekindled old relationships, and before long, she was getting that support, and it was helping her kind of move through this grieving process. But ironically, it was this new church support group that had thrust Hannah into a new horrible situation, one that was playing out on the streets of Sheffield, England, as Hannah, her husband, and her church friends speed walked down the road with this big group following behind them. And so in this group of people with Hannah was obviously her husband, as well as her closest friend from church, whose name was Harriet Ward. And then also there was 3 members of the Favell family. There was Mr. and Mrs. Favell, as well as Mrs. Favell's sister. And all of them were headed to the tenement apartment on Campo Lane, where Harriet Ward and the Favell family lived together. Hannah and her group, and the second group that was following them, all came from the same place. They all went to the same church, and that day, for the previous 2 hours before they all took to the streets here, they had been having this really heated argument about what to do about Harriet and the Favell family's basement. Or, more specifically, what to do about what was in their basement. Some parishioners said that Harriet and the Favell family were just totally making up what was going on in their basement. But other parishioners believed them and said that that basement was so dangerous, nobody should go in it. In fact, we should just board up that basement permanently, or we should just level the entire tenement apartment building. And when that idea began gaining some traction, that lots of people in the church began saying, yeah, let's block off the basement or knock the apartment down, the Favell family and Harriet, who lived in this apartment building and did not want to, permanently block off segments of it or knock it down, they got so angry that they just stood up and left. And at this point, Hannah and her husband just got up and left with their friends. Now, once they got outside, they didn't really have a plan, but they felt strongly that they just needed to get to the Campo Lane tenement apartment building and at a minimum, just be in there to prevent other people from showing up and doing something to the apartment, like trying to knock it down or do something to the basement. And so Hannah and her group began speed walking to the apartment, and this gaggle of other churchgoers who were part of this argument just kind of naturally came outside and followed them. And then when Hannah and her friends reached the apartment building on Campo Lane, they went inside and shut and locked the door behind them. And for a moment, Hannah and the 5 other people she was with, they just stood there in silence, not really sure what to do next. But eventually, one of them said, we gotta do something about the basement, because if we don't, the people outside will. Hannah walked over to the front of the apartment where there was a big window that looked out to the street. And when she looked out there, she saw the big group of people that had followed them were all kind of gathering around the small window that looked down into the Campo Lane tenement apartment basement. It was like all these people were jockeying for position to get the best look. Hannah shut the blind in frustration and then walked back over to the group. And then after a few minutes, Mr. Favell said, guys, it's only going to be daylight for a few more hours. If we're going to do something in the basement, we have to get down there before the daylight is gone. We can't be down there in the dark. The group nodded because they understood why. They definitely did not want to be down there in the dark. And then Mr. Favell looked over at Hannah's husband and he kind of gestured like, why don't we, the 2 of us, go down there together? And Hannah's husband, even though he did not want to go down there, he just nodded and said, okay, let's go. Moments later, Hannah, Harriet, and the 2 Favell women watched as the 2 men opened up the basement door, turned around and looked at the women, and then they slowly began descending the stairs. And then after a couple of minutes, the only sound coming out of the basement was the sound of these 2 men using big metal tools to attempt to break up the stone floor in the basement. For the next 2 hours, Mr. Favell and Hannah's husband continued to smash up the floor in the basement, but every time they removed a big piece of stone, all they'd find was dirt underneath. There was nothing else. Meanwhile, outside, the crowd looking in that window into the basement was only getting bigger and bigger. It was no longer just other members of their church. It was now just random people who saw this big group and walked over to see what was going on. And Hannah, who was at that window looking out into the street, she was seeing this group growing and seeing how rowdy they were getting, and it was starting to make her really nervous. But the nerves she felt about the crowd were nothing compared to the nerves she felt about her husband and Mr. Favell still being in that basement now that the sun was about to set. She did not want them down there in the dark. And finally, when the sun did set and the 2 men still had not come up, Hannah just rushed over to the basement and yelled for them to stop what they were doing and get up here. And the 2 men did as she asked. They dropped their tools and came upstairs looking totally dejected. They had not found the thing they were looking for down there, which meant they had failed. But Hannah and her friends were hoping that now that it was dark outside and the people outside could no longer actually see into the basement because it was too dark, that maybe the crowd would disperse. But as Hannah, her husband, Harriet, and the Favells sat down to have some dinner in the apartment, they looked outside periodically and they saw the crowd was not going away. If anything, the crowd was still continuing to get bigger. Now, you got to remember, this is Sheffield, England in the 1800s. This was a tough place to live. Everybody's working at these factories, doing this awful work 7 days a week for very little money, and there's virtually no entertainment anywhere. It's basically just work, work, work until you die. And so when people in Sheffield saw this big group of people at night standing around this apartment window, it was exciting, and that was pretty rare in their lives, and so they were not about to leave and go home because their lives at home were terrible. And so, by about midnight, there was this huge crowd right outside of the Campo Lane apartment, and it meant that, Hannah and her husband really couldn't leave to go back to their apartment. They were kind of trapped because of this crowd. Also, the crowd was really starting to get rowdy, and the Favell family were starting to get worried that a fight would break out near the basement window, and then maybe the window would break, and then these people would storm into their apartment and maybe rob them. I mean, they didn't know. And so Mrs. Favell came up with this plan to try to get the crowd to leave them alone. And so she ran over to one of the biggest windows on the first floor, and she pulled down the curtain rod and the curtain attached to it, and she handed it to her sister and said, "Go down in the basement and use this curtain rod and curtain to block out the one window this crowd has to look into the basement. If they can't see into the basement, then they'll likely just leave." But Mrs. Favell's sister, after being handed this curtain rod, she's like, "I don't want to go in the basement. It's the middle of the night. I'm not going down there." And over the next couple of minutes, the entire group just kind of bickered about who should be the one to go down into the basement to cover up this window. And nobody wanted to do it. And finally, Hannah, who she's lost her son recently, she just wants to go home at this point, but she can't because of this stupid group. She finally just snaps and says, "You know what? I'll do it." And so she snatches the curtain rod and just walks right over to the basement door. She opens it up and begins descending the stairs before anybody else could stop her. And as she did, her husband and Harriet and the Favell family, they all crowded around the top of the basement stairs, looking down, kind of waiting to see what would happen. Last night, after I tucked old Sega into his little lily pad bed, and I had handed him his nice warm glass of fly milk, I was about to leave the room for the night when the little guy sat up and he said, "Papa, narra mihi fabulam," which of course in traditional Latin means, "Papa, please tell me a story." And I smiled and said, "Of course, Lung. I know Lung is a real sucker for Lung-themed stories. And luckily, because of our new show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, I'm up to my lungs in Lung-themed stories. And so before long, I was regaling old Sega Lung with a story about a man who believed he was just sick, but it turned out he had a tree growing in his lung. Something I'm sure we all can relate to. Speaking of relatability, if you haven't already, you really ought to check out MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, because every week we cover totally strange, baffling medical mysteries that all originate from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. You can listen to MrBallen's Medical Mysteries early on Amazon Music, because on that platform, we release them in batches of 8 episodes at once. But you can also listen to MrBallen's Medical Mysteries on every other podcast platform. However, you only get one new episode every week. Again, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries is available on all podcast platforms for free, but you can listen to it early in batches on Amazon Music, or new episodes once a week on every other platform. Okay, back to the story. And so they all heard as Hannah turned the corner and walked over to that window, and they could hear her kind of messing around with the curtain as she put it in place. And then even though they could not see her down there, because the basement's totally dark, they can't see the window, they heard Hannah call out that she was done. She had put the curtain up, it's blocked, and now she was going to come back upstairs. But after she yelled to them that she was coming back up, it went completely silent in the basement. And for like 5, 6, 7 seconds, all the people at the top of the stairs are waiting anxiously for Hannah to turn the corner and come up the stairs to safety. But then this tense silence was broken with a horrible scream coming out of the basement. It was Hannah, and then silence again. And at this point, Hannah's husband, he's like, "Oh my God, something's happened." And he charges down the stairs and he looks over and he sees Hannah is lying on the ground motionless. There's nothing else in the basement. It's just his wife and this covered up window. And so he runs over, he scoops her up and he runs her back upstairs and he lays her on the ground right outside of the basement door. And then he began to shake her to try to wake her up, but she wasn't waking up. However, it was clear she was still breathing, and so Harriet ran and got a wet towel, and she came back and she kneeled down next to Hannah, and she placed the towel on Hannah's forehead, hoping this wet towel would revive Hannah. But as Harriet is kneeling there, so she's looking at Hannah's body, and the basement door, which is open, is right past Hannah's body, Harriet happened to look up, and so now she's looking into the doorway that leads down into the basement, and her eyes went wide, and she screamed, and then she passed out. The big controversy over this basement began several weeks earlier at the beginning of February when Harriet and the Favell family began hearing all these strange sounds coming out of the basement. Now, initially, they had totally written off these sounds as being, strange creaking and cracking sounds that were just the product of a poorly constructed building with lots of people inside of it. But the noises they were hearing from the basement only got louder and louder and more intense, and they were especially bad at night. And so basically, Harriet and the Favell family were so scared to go down there that they just stopped, especially at night. Sometimes they'd go during the day, but at night it was like, no one's going down there. We don't know what's going on, but I'm not going down there. And then on February 24th, so this is one day before all this craziness happened where, Hannah and her friends get followed to the apartment, and then Hannah goes down and she passes out, and then Harriet passes out. So one day before that, Harriet swore she saw a ghost in the basement. She saw this old woman wearing a white gown kind of moving around in the basement, and the whole time Harriet said this woman, this ghost woman, was pointing at one particular spot on the ground in the basement. And then the same night that Harriet sees this ghost in the basement, Harriet has a dream. And in her dream, she sees this ghost. And again, this ghost is in that basement and it's pointing at the spot on the basement floor. Except in Harriet's dream, this ghost woman speaks to Harriet and says that she was murdered and her gold was stolen from her and buried in the basement right there. And it was this apparent ghost in the Campo Lane basement that was the center of that 2-hour-long argument at the church the following day, which ultimately prompted Hannah, her husband, Harriet, the Favell family, to get up and storm out to go protect the Campo Lane apartment. And then also the secondary group followed right after them, really just to see if they were going to go confront the ghost, because a lot of people thought that's what they're going to go do. And that is basically what Hannah, her husband, and her friends ended up doing. They decided the two men would go down into the basement and attempt to dig up the floor in hopes that they might find this gold that was stolen from this murdered woman and buried in the basement. But they obviously did not find the gold, which ultimately led to Hannah going down and passing out, and then Harriet also passing out. Hannah and Harriet would wake up after passing out. And when they woke up, they would tell these terrifying stories about what they saw. Hannah said she went down the stairs, she went over to the window where all the crowd was looking in, and she managed to get this curtain up, and then she yelled upstairs to her husband and her friends that she was coming back up. But when Hannah actually turned around to go to the stairs, she realized the ghost was in the basement with her. There was this old woman wearing a white gown standing between Hannah and the stairs. She was blocking her way. And this woman was staring at Hannah really intently. And then Hannah screamed, and this ghost charged at Hannah and basically went through her body. And it was at that point that Hannah passed out onto the ground. As for Harriet, when she came to, her story was even more terrifying. Harriet said after she placed that wet towel on Hannah's head, she looked up and she saw the woman in white walking up the stairs, staring directly at Harriet. And Harriet, she froze and kind of leaned back and just stared at this woman. And the woman, she came right to the top of the stairs. She stopped in the doorway, and then she opened up her mouth grotesquely wide and just continued to stare directly at Harriet. And then with slow, trembling hands, the woman began taking off her nightgown, which eventually fell to the ground. And Harriet saw this woman was covered in cuts and gashes all over her chest and neck. And then Harriet let out a scream, and she passed out too. Not long after Hannah and Harriet both came to and told their horrible stories, the police arrived outside and dispersed the big crowd, which meant Hannah and her husband could finally leave and go back to their own apartment, and they would. But just 12 hours later, Hannah would die. The Sheffield coroner held an inquest into Hannah's death, but he could find no scientific explanation for why Hannah actually died. And so on her death certificate, it basically says she died of fright. She was literally scared to death. Following Hannah's very bizarre and basically unexplained death, Harriet, who would survive, and the Favell family, they just moved out. They could not stand to be at that apartment any longer. And then also many more people who lived inside of this tenement apartment building on Campbell Lane, they also moved out because, again, it was just too terrifying to be near this basement. To this day, we still don't have a better explanation for what happened to Hannah. She was in good health, all things considered, when she died. And so really this didn't make any sense. And so this case still is one of the only in recorded history where somebody apparently died just from getting scared.
Late one night in the spring of 1937, a young woman stumbled into her New York City apartment building, drunk from a long night of partying with friends. She made her way up the steps and reached her apartment door, and after she opened it up, she stepped inside and her little dog ran up to say hello, and so she gave her dog a pet, and then she walked towards her bedroom. But the moment she stepped foot into that pitch-black bedroom, something just felt off. It was too quiet. But before she could figure out why that was, something heavy came flying out of the darkness and hit her on the face. And for a moment, the woman just stood there, stunned. And then a second later, something else emerged from the darkness. 2 hands.
So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast, where we have hundreds of stories, a lot like this one, that are only available on the podcast. They are not on YouTube. Again, the podcast is just called the MrBallen's Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music.